The blade pressed cold against Elena Voss's throat before she even registered the sound of footsteps behind her. She did not scream. Screaming wasted air, and air was something she might need in the next few seconds to think her way out of this. Her eyes locked on the flicker of torchlight sliding along the edge of the knife, and her mind, sharp even through the fear, began counting everything around her that might help her survive the next 30 seconds. A stone wall to her left, an open doorway 6 steps ahead. A man's arm wrapped tight across her collarbone, strong but slightly unsteady, the kind of unsteady that came from nerves rather than confidence. "You should not be back here," the man hissed against her ear. "This corridor belongs to the King's Guard." "Then maybe the King's Guard should hire people who can hold a knife without shaking," Elena said. It was not the wisest thing to say to a stranger with a blade against her neck, but Elena Voss had never been particularly gifted at staying quiet, when silence would have kept her safer. The arm around her tightened, and for one terrible heartbeat she thought she had gambled wrong. Then a voice cut through the corridor, low and absolute, and every torch flame in the hallway seemed to bend toward the sound of it. "Drop it, now." The command did not rise in volume. It did not need to. The man holding Elena went rigid, and his fingers loosened on the hilt of the knife before his mind had fully caught up with his body's obedience. Elena turned her head just enough to see the source of that voice, and found herself looking at a man who filled the width of the corridor without moving an inch, dressed entirely in black, his eyes the deep gray of a storm still deciding whether to break. King Damien Ashford did not carry a weapon in his hand. He did not need one. Power radiated from him, the way heat rises from a flame, and the attacker took one look at his face and let the knife clatter against the stone floor. "Please," the man stammered. "I was only paid to." He never finished the sentence. 2 guards Elena had not even noticed stepped from the shadows and dragged him backward, his protests fading into the dark corridor until silence swallowed the hallway whole. Elena pressed 2 fingers against her throat, checking for blood more out of instinct than genuine worry. There was none. The blade had never broken skin. "You are not hurt." Damien's voice had dropped, no longer a command but something quieter, almost careful. "No," Elena said, "though I would have appreciated a slightly faster rescue." His gaze moved over her, quick, searching, the kind of look that checked for injuries a person might be too proud to admit to. Elena had encountered powerful men before, merchants and minor lords who looked at people the way they looked at goods, weighing value at a glance. Damien's attention felt entirely different, careful in a way that unsettled her more than the knife had. "Who are you?" he asked. "And why is a stranger holding a blade to your throat in my own hallway?" "Elena Voss," she said. "I was hired to translate for the northern delegates tonight. I took a wrong turn looking for the summit hall, and apparently that was enough to get me marked as a threat." A muscle in his jaw shifted. "No guest is attacked in my halls without reason. Someone sent that man after you specifically." "Lucky me," Elena said dryly. "I didn't realize translating trade contracts came with this much risk attached." For the briefest instant, something flickered across Damien's face that might have almost been the beginning of a smile, gone before she could be certain she had truly seen it. "Come with me," he said. "You will be safer near the main hall. I don't need an escort." "You needed one 5 minutes ago." She opened her mouth to argue and closed it again, because he was right, and she resented that he was right, and resented even more that her pulse had not slowed down since the blade left her skin, though some quiet part of her already suspected fear was no longer the only reason for that. They walked together, his pace slower than she guessed came naturally to him, as though some instinct in him did not trust her legs to hold steady after what had happened. She noticed, and said nothing, filing the detail away with the rest of the strange evening. The summit hall, when they reached it, buzzed with color and noise, long tables heavy with food from every region of the kingdom. Delegates in fine cloth clustered in careful conversation. Elena had grown up in a village where meals were simple, and clothing was chosen for warmth rather than display. And though she had learned over the years how to move through grand rooms without shrinking, tonight, walking beside the king, she felt every eye in the hall turn toward them at once. "They're staring," she murmured. "They always stare," Damien said. "It has nothing to do with you." It did, and they both knew it. A king did not walk a stranger into his hall with his hand hovering protectively near her back, without every noble present wondering exactly why. Your Majesty. The voice was smooth, practiced, belonging to a tall man with silver rings on every finger, who approached with a smile wide enough to show every tooth. I see you've recovered our missing translator. We worried the northern delegates would be reduced to gestures all evening. Lord Caleb, Damien said, his tone dropping several degrees colder. Miss Voss was delayed by an incident in the East Corridor. I trust your men had no part in that. Lord Caleb's smile did not waver, but Elena, who had spent years reading the small movements of people who wanted something from her, caught the flicker behind his eyes before he masked it. An incident? How troubling. I will have my people look into it at once. See that you do, Damien said. Caleb bowed, his gaze sliding to Elena for a moment too long, before he melted back into the crowd, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than it should have. You think he sent the man with the knife? Elena said quietly, once he was out of earshot. I think many things, Damien said. I rarely speak them aloud until I have proof. That sounds exhausting. It is. They reached the far edge of the hall, near tall doors leading out to a stone balcony overlooking the sleeping city. Damien gestured toward the open night air, and Elena, glad for any excuse to leave the crowded hall behind, stepped outside. The city spread beneath them in a quilt of golden light, threads of lanterns tracing the streets down toward a dark ribbon of sea. Elena had never seen anything like it. Her own village, days of travel from this place, held perhaps 30 homes and a single well. This looked like something pulled from the stories her grandmother used to tell before bed. Stories Elena had never quite believed were real. It's beautiful, she said, before she could stop the words. It is, Damien agreed, though when she glanced at him, his eyes were not on the city at all. They were on her. Heat rose in her cheeks, and she looked away quickly, irritated at herself for reacting like a foolish girl when she had long ago promised herself she would never be foolish over anyone, king or otherwise. You don't need to keep watching me, she said. I already told you I'm fine. I am not watching you because I think you are hurt. Then why? He did not answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that she thought he might never answer at all. She was preparing something sharp to fill the quiet when he finally spoke. Because in 5 years of ruling this kingdom, no one has spoken to me the way you did in that corridor. Most people are too afraid. I wasn't trying to be brave, she admitted. I think I was simply too annoyed to be frightened. That earned her the smile she had almost caught earlier, small, real, and gone again, before she could be sure of it, though this time, she had seen it clearly, and something in her chest turned over strangely at the sight of it. Where are you from, Elena Voss? A village called Hollow Creek. It's small. You've probably never heard of it. I haven't, he admitted. Tell me about it. And so she did, standing on a stone balcony, overlooking a kingdom larger than anything she had imagined, telling the most powerful man she had ever met about goats and wells, and the way her grandmother used to braid ribbons into her hair on market days. He listened as though it mattered, as though every ordinary detail of her small life deserved his full attention, and Elena found herself talking longer than she meant to, caught in the unfamiliar comfort of being truly heard by someone who could have any conversation he wanted with anyone in the kingdom, and had chosen this one instead. She told him about the well that ran dry every summer, and how the whole village would gather to dig it deeper together, children included, everyone taking turns hauling buckets of loose earth. She told him about the market days when traveling merchants would bring cloth-dyed colors she had never seen before, and how she used to save small copper coins for a whole season just to buy a single ribbon the color of a robin's egg. She told him about her grandmother's stories, tales of kings and queens and castles floating somewhere far beyond the hills, stories she had listened to as a child, never believing she would one day stand inside one. Damien listened without interrupting, his attention so complete it made her almost self-conscious, though not in the way attention from powerful men usually made her feel. There was no calculation in his eyes, no measuring of her worth against some invisible scale. He simply listened, and when she finished, he asked another question, drawing out another memory, as if her ordinary life fascinated him more than any of the political intrigue currently swirling through the hall behind them. You speak of Hollow Creek like it no longer exists, he said gently, after a while. Elena's smile faltered slightly. In a way, it doesn't. Not the way it did when I was young. A raid came through when I was 12. The village survived, mostly, but it was never quite the same afterward. "I'm sorry," Damien said, and the words carried a weight that told her he meant them fully, not simply as polite conversation. "Were your parents there?" "They didn't survive it," Elena said quietly. It was easier to say now, after so many years, though the words never lost their weight entirely. "I was raised afterward by neighbors, mostly. I learned quickly how to take care of myself." Something shifted in Damien's expression, a tightening around his eyes that spoke of genuine grief on her behalf, rather than performed sympathy. "That is a heavy thing to carry, at any age, let alone 12. "I've carried heavier since," Elena said, attempting lightness, though the words did not quite land as casually as she intended. It was Lord Caleb's voice, calling from inside the hall, that finally broke the moment. "Your Majesty, the northern delegates are asking for you." Damien's jaw tightened, but he nodded, the king sliding back over his features like a mask returning to its place. "I must go," he said. "Will you find your way back safely?" "I found my way here just fine," Elena said, though the memory of the knife made the words feel less certain than she wanted them to sound. "I will have someone escort you regardless." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Damien said. "I want to." Something in the quiet certainty of his voice stole the argument right out of her mouth. She nodded instead, and he turned to go, pausing at the doorway to look back at her one last time before disappearing into the noise of the hall. Elena stood alone on the balcony for a long moment, the cool night air doing little to slow the strange rhythm of her heart. She thought of the knife at her throat, of Lord Caleb's too wide smile, of the way Damien's presence had filled the corridor before she even saw him standing there. She thought, most of all, of the way he had looked at her, as though she were something worth protecting, not because of a name or a title, since she carried neither, but simply because she was herself. That frightened her more than the knife had. Elena Voss had spent her whole life building walls. She had watched her parents die in a raid on Hollow Creek when she was young, had watched the men meant to protect the village arrive too late, if they arrived at all. She had learned early that depending on anyone, especially anyone wielding power, was a fast road toward disappointment. She had built her entire life on the belief that she needed no one, that her own wit and her own two hands would always be enough to see her through, and that no alpha, no king, no man with a title before his name, would ever hold enough sway over her heart to make her forget that lesson. And yet here she stood, only a few hours into a night that was supposed to involve nothing more than translation work, already thinking about storm-colored eyes, and a voice that had stopped a knife with nothing but its own quiet weight. A young guard approached the balcony a short while later, sent, he explained, by the king himself, to walk Miss Voss safely back to her quarters. Elena followed him through the winding halls, past the noise of the hall, and down quieter corridors, lit by torches that threw long shadows against the stone. Her mind kept circling back to the evening's events, turning each detail over like a stone she was searching for cracks in. She did not see Lord Caleb watching from an upper walkway, his silver rings catching torchlight as his eyes tracked her all the way to her door. She did not hear him murmur, low and thoughtful, to the man standing beside him in the shadows. "So that's the one who has caught his attention. How very interesting. Should we be concerned, my lord?" Lord Caleb's smile returned, cold and unhurried. "Concerned is not the word I would choose. Opportunity is a far better one." In her quarters, unaware of the eyes that had followed her, Elena sat by the window and looked out over the lights of the sleeping kingdom, turning the strange evening over and over in her mind, refusing to admit, even to herself, that she was already looking forward to seeing the king again before the next sunrise. She told herself it was only curiosity. She told herself the tightness still lodged in her chest was leftover fear from the blade, nothing more. She told herself a great many things that night, lying awake in an unfamiliar bed inside an unfamiliar castle, and she believed almost none of them by the time sleep finally found her. Outside her window, far below in the castle gardens, Damien Ashford stood alone, having slipped away from his own summit for a handful of stolen minutes, staring up at the single lit window of a woman he had known for less than a night, and could not stop thinking about regardless. He did not understand it fully. He had ruled with a clear head and a carefully guarded heart for 5 long years, had learned to view every person who approached him as a piece moving across a board, each one calculating their own advantage. He had never once, in all that time, felt the pull he felt now, standing beneath a stranger's window, like a man who had lost every sensible instinct he once possessed. He told himself it would pass. He told himself a summit was no place for distraction, that a translator from a village he had never even heard of before tonight was not someone a king should be losing sleep over on the very first evening of their acquaintance. He, too, believed almost none of it, and he knew it even as he thought it. Above him, the light in Elena's window finally went dark, and Damien turned back toward the castle, already certain, with the same instinct that had made him a feared and respected ruler for half a decade, that whatever had begun in that corridor tonight was only the first small thread of something far larger still waiting to unravel. Sleep did not come easily, despite the exhaustion pulling at Elena's limbs. She lay in the unfamiliar bed for what felt like hours, listening to the distant sounds of the castle settling for the night. Footsteps fading in far corridors, a door closing somewhere below, the wind moving through the garden trees beneath her window. Eventually, restless and unable to quiet her thoughts, she rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and slipped out into the hallway, telling herself a short walk might loosen the tight knot of nerves still lodged behind her ribs. The corridors at this hour felt different from the ones she had walked earlier that evening, quieter, dimmer, the torches burned lower and further apart. She had not gone far before she nearly collided with a young woman carrying a stack of folded linens, who startled so badly she nearly dropped the entire pile. "I'm so sorry," Elena said quickly, steadying the young woman's arm before the linens could scatter across the floor. "I didn't mean to frighten you." "No harm done, miss," the woman said, catching her breath with a small, relieved laugh. "Though guests aren't usually wandering these halls so late, I'm Grace. I work in the household stores. Elena, I'm a translator, here for the summit. I couldn't sleep." Grace's expression shifted into something sympathetic. "First night in a strange castle will do that. Takes most folk a few days to settle in properly. Can I fetch you anything? Warm milk, perhaps? Or a lantern for your room?" "I'm fine, thank you. I only needed to walk for a moment." Elena hesitated, then asked the question that had been circling her mind since the corridor. "Grace, can I ask you something? Do you know much about Lord Caleb?" Something careful entered Grace's expression, the kind of caution Elena recognized from her own years of learning, which questions were safe to answer honestly, and which were not. "He's a powerful lord, miss. One of the king's closest advisors, or so it said." "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Elena said, though the words came out less convincing than she intended. Grace studied her for a moment, then lowered her voice slightly, glancing down the empty corridor, as though checking for listening ears. "I'll only say this, miss, because you seem kind, and because you're new here, and don't know the ways of this place yet. Lord Caleb smiles a great deal. Smiling costs him nothing. But I've worked in this castle 6 years, and I've never once seen that smile reach his eyes. Whatever business you have with him, mind yourself carefully." The warning settled uneasily in Elena's chest, confirming something she had already begun to suspect on her own. "Thank you, Grace. I'll remember that." "Get some rest, miss," Grace said, shifting her stack of linens more securely against her hip. "The castle looks less strange in daylight, I promise you that much." Elena thanked her again, and continued her slow walk, though her thoughts now circled Lord Caleb, rather than settling into the calm she had hoped to find. She thought of his too wide smile, of the flicker behind his eyes when Damien had questioned him about the attack, of the way his gaze had lingered on her a moment too long, before he melted back into the crowd. Grace's warning had done nothing to ease her nerves, only sharpened them further. She turned back toward her quarters, deciding that whatever answers waited in this castle, they would keep until morning, when her mind might be sharper and her body less exhausted from the long, strange day behind her. As she rounded the final corner toward her door, however, she caught sight of a figure standing near the far end of the corridor, still and watchful, gone the moment she blinked, swallowed back into shadow, before she could be certain she had seen anyone there at all. Her heart pounded as she hurried the last few steps to her door, slipping inside and pressing her back against the solid wood once it was closed and locked behind her. She told herself it had been nothing, a trick of tired eyes and torchlight, a shadow shaped by exhaustion rather than any real threat lurking in the halls. But she did not fully believe that either, and when sleep finally claimed her sometime near dawn, it came thin and restless, filled with half-formed dreams of storm-gray eyes and silver rings, and a corridor that seemed to stretch on forever, no matter how quickly she tried to run. She woke the next morning to soft gray light filtering through her window, and for one disoriented moment, forgot entirely where she was. Then memory returned in a rush. The knife, the king, the balcony, the shadow at the end of the hallway, and Elena sat up quickly, pressing the heels of her hands against her tired eyes. Whatever this castle held in store for her, she understood, with sudden, absolute clarity. Her quiet, uncomplicated life as a village translator had already ended the moment that blade touched her throat. What waited beyond this room, she could not yet know. But she suspected, with a certainty that settled deep and cold in her stomach, that the danger she had survived last night was only the very beginning of something far larger still gathering in the shadows around her. Morning came to the castle grounds slow and gray, mist curling low over the gardens like something alive. Elena dressed quickly, choosing the plainest of the clothes she had brought with her, unwilling to borrow anything finer, even though a servant had offered the evening before. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts before she had finished lacing her boots. She opened it expecting a servant, and found Damien instead, dressed more simply than the night before, though nothing about him looked any less like a king. "You're an early riser," she said, surprised. "I don't sleep much," he admitted. "I wanted to see that you were well this morning, after everything. I told you, I'm fine. I know what you told me. I wanted to see it for myself." She crossed her arms, fighting a small smile that wanted to break across her face, despite the exhaustion still clinging to her limbs. "Do you check on all your translators this closely, or is it just the ones who get knives held to their throats?" "Only that one," Damien said, and this time his smile lingered a moment longer than the one from the night before. They walked together through a quiet garden path, while he explained that the man who attacked her had been questioned through the night and had confessed to being paid, though he claimed not to know by whom the payment had originated. Damien suspected Lord Caleb, though suspicion was not proof, and a king could not move openly against a lord of the realm without something far stronger to stand on. "Why would he want to hurt me?" Elena asked. "I'm no one important. I only came here to translate contracts." "You are not no one," Damien said, quiet and certain. "And I intend to discover exactly why Lord Caleb believes otherwise." They had barely finished the thought when a servant found them near the garden's edge, breathless from hurrying, and pressed a folded note into Elena's hand, explaining it had been found tucked beneath her door some time before dawn. Elena's stomach tightened even before she unfolded the paper, some instinct already warning her the morning's calm was about to end. The handwriting was careful, unfamiliar, deliberately plain, in a way that told her whoever wrote it had tried hard to leave no distinguishing trace behind. "Leave before the next full moon," it read, "or the next blade will not miss." Elena read it twice, her pulse hammering, before Damien's hand closed gently over hers, steadying the paper so he could read it as well. She watched his face change as the words registered, watched the careful control he wore like armor crack, just slightly, to reveal something sharper and more dangerous beneath it. "Who else has seen this?" he asked, his voice gone low and tight. "No one. The servant brought it straight to me, and I came straight to you." Something in his shoulders eased, very slightly, at that answer, though the tightness in his jaw remained entirely unchanged. "You will not be leaving this castle," he said. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, not until I know exactly who wrote this, and why. I have a life outside these walls, Damien. A village, people who will wonder where I've gone. And I have a kingdom full of people who wonder about a great many things, every single day," he said. "None of that matters if you are dead." The word landed heavy between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elena watched him fold the letter carefully, watched him press it flat against his palm, as though trying to steady himself through the simple act of holding it. "I will send word to your village," he said finally, quieter now. "I will make certain they know you are safe and cared for, and that you will return the moment it is truly safe to do so. But I will not send you back out there while someone is trying to end your life, Elena. I cannot do that. Cannot or will not." His eyes met hers, storm gray and unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him. Both. Elena did not have an answer for that. She was not entirely sure she wanted one. She only knew that standing in that quiet garden, with danger folded into a stranger's careful handwriting, and a king looking at her as though she mattered more than his own crown. Something inside her that had stayed locked tight for years had begun, very quietly, to come undone. Word of the letter did not stay contained for long. By the time the sun set that same day, whispers had already begun moving through the castle halls, carried on the tongues of servants and nobles alike, each version of the story stranger than the last. Some claimed the translator had insulted a lord, and been threatened for it. Others whispered that she had bewitched the king himself, and that jealous rivals wanted her removed before she could climb any higher. Elena heard none of these rumors directly, but she saw them reflected in the way people looked at her when she passed through the halls, in the sudden silences that fell over conversations the moment she entered a room. She had never wanted attention. She had spent her whole life trying to remain small, unnoticed, safe, within her own quiet corner of the world. Now, in the span of a single day, she had become the center of a storm she had never asked to be any part of. Damien, for his part, moved through the castle with a focus that unsettled even his own guards. He questioned every servant with access to the eastern corridor. He reviewed the summit's guest lists twice over, searching for any name that connected back to the merchant houses known to trade in dangerous favors. He sat for hours with his most trusted advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya who had served his family for 2 decades, working through every possible thread that might lead back to whoever had written that letter. "You are certain it was not simply meant to frighten her into leaving quietly," Priya said, studying the note Damien had brought to her private study. "Some people do not want outsiders lingering too long within royal circles, particularly not outsiders who catch a king's attention so quickly. If someone wanted her gone quietly, a letter would be enough on its own," Damien said. "A knife is not subtle. Someone wants her afraid, yes, but they also want her dead, if fear alone fails to work quickly enough." Priya's sharp eyes studied him for a long moment. "You care for this woman." It was not phrased as a question, and Damien did not treat it as one. He said nothing, which, to a woman who had known him since he was a boy, learning to hold a sword too heavy for his own hands, was answer enough on its own. "Be careful, Damien," Priya said gently. "A king's heart is rarely his own to give freely. There are those within this court who will use anything, and anyone, against you, if it serves their own purpose well enough. I know that better than most," Damien said. "It does not change how I feel." That evening, unable to sit still in her quarters any longer, Elena wandered the castle gardens, drawn by the sound of water from a small fountain tucked between rows of flowering vines. She had always found comfort in gardens, in the quiet company of growing things that asked nothing of her, and judged her for nothing in return. She did not hear the footsteps behind her, until Lord Caleb's voice broke the evening silence. "Miss Voss, I hoped I might find you alone." Elena turned, her body tensing before her mind fully caught up with the reason why. Lord Caleb stood a few steps away, silver rings catching the last light of evening, his smile as wide and empty as it had been the night of the summit. "Lord Caleb," she said carefully, "I didn't realize you were looking for me." "I heard about your letter," he said, tilting his head with an expression of practiced concern. "Terrible business. This kingdom has grown careless if strangers can be threatened so easily within its own walls." "I'm not sure I'd call myself a stranger anymore." "No," Caleb agreed, his eyes sharpening just slightly. "I suppose you wouldn't, given how quickly you've made yourself at home in the king's private study. Quite the achievement for a village translator." Elena felt her spine straighten at the insult tucked so neatly inside his words. "I was invited there. I didn't force my way in." "Of course not," Caleb said smoothly. "I only wonder, Miss Voss, what happens to women who find themselves too close to a king's attention, when that attention inevitably moves elsewhere. It happens, you know. Kings are not known for constancy. Is there a reason you're telling me this, or do you simply enjoy the sound of your own voice?" Something flickered behind Caleb's practiced smile. There and gone so quickly, Elena nearly missed it entirely. "I am telling you this because I would hate to see someone as clever as yourself, caught up in something far larger than she understands. This kingdom has rules, Miss Voss. History. Alliances stretching back generations. A translator from a village no one has heard of does not simply walk into the center of that and remain unchanged by it. Is that a warning, my lord? or a threat? Caleb's smile widened, sharp at the edges now. Considerate advice, freely given. Leave while you still can, Miss Voss, before this kingdom's politics decide your fate for you. He bowed, shallow and mocking, and turned to leave, his footsteps unhurried, as he disappeared back into the shadowed garden path. Elena stood alone by the fountain for a long moment afterward, heart pounding, replaying his words over and over, searching for the true threat hidden beneath the smooth surface of his voice. She did not tell Damien about the conversation that night, though she suspected the omission would not sit easily with either of them once it eventually came to light. She found Damien later that evening anyway, unable to stay away despite her own uncertainty, and found him standing on the same balcony where they had first spoken of goats and villages and other ordinary things. He turned when he heard her approach, and something in his face eased at the sight of her, the tension of the day melting away just slightly. "I was hoping you would come," he admitted. "I wasn't sure I should." "Why not?" Elena hesitated, Caleb's words still echoing faintly in her mind, warning her away from exactly this kind of moment. "Because every part of this feels dangerous. The letter, the knife, Lord Caleb watching me like I'm a puzzle he hasn't finished solving yet. I came here to translate contracts, Damien, not to become part of whatever this is turning into." "And what do you think this is?" he asked quietly. She did not have an answer ready. Or rather, she had an answer, but it frightened her too much to speak it aloud, standing on a balcony beside a king who had knelt for no one and never would, and yet who looked at her now as if she alone held something he had spent his whole life searching for, without ever knowing its proper name. "I don't know," she said instead, which was not quite a lie, but was not quite the whole truth either. Damien studied her for a long moment, and then, rather than pressing her further, he simply held out his hand, palm up, an offer rather than a demand. "Then let's not decide tonight," he said. "Let's simply stand here a while longer and worry about the rest of it tomorrow." Elena looked at his hand for a long moment, weighing every warning Caleb had given her against the quiet steadiness she found in Damien's eyes, and then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. It was a small thing, and yet it felt like the first true step off the safe, solid ground she had built her entire life upon, out into something far more uncertain and far more alive than anything she had known before that night. Neither of them spoke for a long while after that, content simply to stand together in the cool evening air, watching the lantern lights flicker across the sleeping city below, the weight of the letter and the danger it carried pushed, for a little while, into some quieter corner of both their minds. "Tell me something true," Elena said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "About what?" "Anything. Something no one else knows about you. It seems only fair, since half the castle already seems to know more about my life than I do about yours." Damien was quiet for a moment, considering the request with the same careful weight he seemed to give every decision, however small. "When I was young, before I became king, I was terrified of failing my father's legacy. He ruled with a kind of effortless confidence I never believed I could match. I used to practice speeches alone in my chambers at night, terrified someone might overhear how uncertain I actually felt. And now? Now I understand that confidence is not the absence of fear," he said. "It is simply choosing to act, despite it. I still feel uncertain more often than most people would guess. I have simply learned to carry it quietly." Elena felt something warm unfurl in her chest, at the honesty of the admission, at the trust it represented, a king choosing to show her something soft and unguarded, rather than the polished, untouchable figure the rest of the court believed him to be. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "Your turn," Damien said. "Something true, that no one else knows." Elena considered the request carefully, searching through years of carefully guarded memories, for something she had never spoken aloud to anyone. "I used to lie awake some nights, after my parents died, imagining conversations with them. What they would think of the choices I was making, whether they would be proud of the woman I was becoming. I still do it sometimes, even now. I know it probably sounds foolish." "It doesn't sound foolish at all," Damien said, his voice gentle, in a way that steadied something fragile in her chest. "It sounds like love that never really left, even after the people carrying it did." Elena felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back quickly, unused to being understood so completely by someone she had known for barely a full day. They stood together a while longer, trading small truths back and forth beneath the stars, each admission drawing them a little closer, until the cool night air finally grew too sharp to ignore, and Damien, reluctantly, suggested they both return inside, before the hour grew later still. At her door he paused, studying her face with an expression she could not quite name. Whatever the letter's threat means, Elena, I promise you will not face it alone. Whatever choice you make about staying or leaving, about any of this, I will not let harm come to you, if it is within my power to prevent it. That's a large promise for someone you've known less than 2 full days, Elena said softly. Some things do not require years to become certain, Damien said. I learned that lesson standing in a dark corridor, watching a woman argue with a man holding a knife to her throat, rather than simply staying silent and afraid. Elena managed a small, tired laugh despite the weight still pressing against her chest. I suppose that does sound like me. Rest well, Elena, Damien said, his voice softening further. Tomorrow, we begin finding whoever wrote that letter, and we make certain they understand exactly how seriously their threat has been taken. Neither of them saw the figure watching from the shadowed archway above the garden, nor heard the soft, satisfied sound of breath drawn slowly through a practiced smile, as plans already set in motion continued turning quietly forward, unseen and unheard, waiting patiently for their moment to finally arrive. 3 days passed in a strange, fragile peace. Damien doubled the guards stationed near Elena's quarters, careful never to make her feel like a prisoner within the very walls meant to protect her. Priya continued her quiet investigation into the letter, though every thread she pulled seemed to lead back toward shadows rather than names she could act upon. Elena finished her translation work for the summit's remaining delegates, though she found her concentration fraying more with each passing day, her mind wandering again and again back to storm-gray eyes and an offered hand she had not been brave enough to refuse. It was on the 4th evening, during a quiet dinner in Damien's private chambers, that Priya finally arrived, with news that changed everything they thought they understood about the danger surrounding them. I have a name, she said, breathless from hurrying through the halls. The man who held the knife to Elena's throat finally spoke, in exchange for a lighter sentence. He was paid, exactly as we suspected, but not by Lord Caleb directly. Then by who? Damien asked, rising from his chair. Priya's expression turned grave. By someone claiming to represent the Silver Court, Damien. If that's true, this is not simply about Elena being an inconvenience to some jealous lord. This is about something far older, and far more dangerous, than a single man protecting his position at court. Elena watched the color drain slightly from Damien's face, watched the careful control he wore like a second skin tighten into something harder and more focused than she had yet seen from him. What is the Silver Court? She asked quietly. Damien turned to her, and for the first time since meeting him, she saw real fear behind his eyes, not for himself, but unmistakably for her. It's an old alliance, he said slowly, one that believes the bloodline of true mates should never be allowed to form outside their control. If they've involved themselves in this, Elena, then this was never truly about you being a threat to Lord Caleb's ambitions alone. Then what was it about? Damien's jaw tightened, and when he finally answered, his voice had gone quiet and grave, in a way that made Elena's chest ache with a dread she could not fully name. It was about you being exactly who I have begun to believe you are. The words settled over the room like a heavy fog, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Elena felt her pulse pounding in her ears, the strange, electric awareness she had carried since that first corridor, suddenly making a terrible kind of sense. Say it plainly, she said. I'm tired of half-answers tonight. Damien crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, though he did not reach for her. Among my people, there is a bond called the mate bond. It is rare. Most alphas live their whole lives without ever feeling it fully. It cannot be chosen, or created, or faked. It simply is. The moment two souls recognize each other as belonging together, whether either person is ready for that recognition or not. And you think we have this bond? I know we do, Damien said quietly. I felt it the moment I saw you in that corridor. I told myself it was concern, or curiosity, or the simple strangeness of the night. I have spent every day since trying to convince myself it was something smaller than what it actually is. Elena's throat tightened. Part of her wanted to laugh, to dismiss this as another strange custom belonging to a world she had only just stumbled into by accident. But some deeper, quieter part of her recognized the truth in his words, recognized it in the way her chest had eased the moment she stepped into a room with him, recognized it in the way she had thought of him constantly in the days since, unable to explain why a king she barely knew had already carved himself so deeply into her thoughts. Why would the Silver Court care about that? She asked, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the tremor beneath it. Why would anyone want to kill me over a bond I didn't even know existed until 5 minutes ago? Priya answered, before Damien could, her voice careful and grave. Because a king bound to a true mate cannot be controlled the way a king bound to a political marriage can be. The Silver Court has spent generations arranging alliances through careful matches, ensuring every ruling bloodline remains tied to their influence and their interests. A true mate bond threatens all of that. It cannot be bought, or arranged, or broken by outside pressure. To them, it is not a blessing at all. It is a devastating loss of power. So they would rather see me dead than allow the bond to exist. Yes, Damien said, the single word heavy with a fury he was clearly working hard to control. And I will not allow that to happen, not while I still draw breath. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room around her. This is insane. 3 days ago, I was translating trade contracts for men who barely looked at me twice. Now you're telling me some ancient court wants me dead because of a bond I never asked for, with a king I've known for less than a week. I know how impossible this sounds, Damien said gently. I would not blame you if you wanted to run from all of it, from me, from this kingdom, from everything the Silver Court represents. But I need you to know that whatever you decide, I will not let anyone harm you. Bond or no bond, that will not change. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the deception Caleb had warned her about, any hint that this was some elaborate scheme meant to trap her within palace politics she did not fully understand. She found none. What she found instead was a man standing very still, holding himself carefully in check, as though the smallest wrong move might shatter whatever fragile trust had grown between them over these past few days. I'm not running, she said finally, surprising herself with how steady the words came out. I've spent my whole life running from things I couldn't control. I'm tired of it. I would rather face this directly than spend another lifetime looking over my shoulder. Something in Damien's shoulders eased, just slightly, at her words, though the worry in his eyes did not fully disappear. Then we face this together, he said, starting with finding out exactly how deep the Silver Court's reach extends into my own court. Priya cleared her throat gently, drawing their attention back to the more immediate danger still hanging over the room. There is one more thing you should know. The man who confessed said the payment came with instructions. If the first 2 attempts failed, a third would follow before the next full moon, during the closing ceremony of the summit. They intend to make an example of her, publicly, in front of every delegate gathered here. The full moon was 5 days away. Elena felt the weight of that number settle heavy in her chest, but beneath the fear, something else stirred as well, something sharper and more determined than she had expected to find inside herself. She had spent her whole life being the one things happened to, the girl whose village burned while help arrived too late, the woman assumed weak simply because she carried no title and commanded no army of her own. She was tired of being underestimated by people who had never bothered to learn what she was truly capable of. Then we have 5 days to make sure their plan fails, she said. Damien looked at her with something that might have been pride, mixed with a fear he did not bother trying to hide. Elena, this is not a small danger. The Silver Court does not make idle threats, and they do not give up easily once they've set their sights on something. Neither do I, she said. I told you already, Damien. I don't need an alpha to protect me. I've survived a great deal on my own already. But if you're offering to stand beside me, instead of over me, I won't refuse that offer. The words seemed to settle something between them, a shift so quiet it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying close attention. Priya, watching the exchange with sharp, knowing eyes, allowed herself the faintest of smiles, before excusing herself to continue her investigation, leaving the two of them alone together in the quiet chamber. You are not what I expected, Damien said softly, once the door had closed behind Priya. What did you expect? Someone smaller, someone who would need constant protecting, who would look to me for every answer without question. He shook his head slowly, something like wonder crossing his features. Instead, I find someone who argues with me, in dark corridors, while a blade is still against her throat, who refuses to run, even when an ancient court wants her dead, who makes me want to be a better king, simply by expecting nothing less from me in return. Elena felt her cheeks warm, despite the seriousness still hanging over the moment. Don't go soft on me now, Your Majesty. We have a conspiracy to unravel before the next full moon. The smile that broke across his face this time was full and real, chasing away, for just a moment, the shadows the conversation had brought into the room between them. As you wish, he said. Though I reserve the right to go soft on you again later, once this particular danger has passed us by. Over the following days, the castle transformed into something between a fortress and a puzzle box. Every hallway searched carefully, every servant questioned with patience, every possible entry point sealed and guarded around the clock. Priya worked tirelessly, tracing threads of correspondence and coin that eventually led to a merchant house within the city, one long suspected of harboring sympathies for the Silver Court beneath a perfectly respectable trading front. Elena, refusing to sit idle while others fought a battle meant partly for her own protection, threw herself into the investigation as well, her sharp mind and outsider's perspective catching details the palace-bred guards and advisors often overlooked entirely. She noticed patterns in the delegate schedules that suggested inside knowledge of the palace's movements. She recognized, from her own years of village life, the particular careful nervousness of a servant boy who flinched every single time Lord Caleb's name was mentioned within his hearing. That boy, gently questioned by Damien himself, rather than the guards who might have frightened him into complete silence, finally admitted, in a shaking voice, that he had been paid to leave a side door unlocked during the closing ceremony, though he swore, tears in his eyes, that he did not know why, and had been too afraid to refuse the payment when it was offered. You did the right thing telling us, Damien said gently, kneeling to meet the boy's frightened eyes directly. You will not be punished for this. You will be protected, and so will your family, for as long as you need it. The boy's relief was immediate and visible, and Elena, watching from the doorway, felt something warm settle in her chest at the sight of a king choosing kindness over cruelty, in a moment where cruelty would have been so much easier, and so much more expected of someone in his position. With the unlocked door identified, a trap of their own began slowly to take shape. Rather than sealing the door and losing whatever advantage the knowledge gave them, Damien and Priya devised a plan to let the door remain seemingly unguarded, while filling the surrounding halls with hidden guards, ready to close the trap the moment the Silver Court's agents made their move against her. That night, lying awake in her chambers, Elena found herself thinking not of the danger waiting 5 days ahead, but of the strange, quiet certainty that had settled over her since Damien's confession about the bond between them. She had spent her whole life refusing to need anyone, and yet here she was, trusting a king she had known less than a week with her very survival, and finding, to her own great surprise, that the trust did not feel like weakness at all. It felt, instead, like the first true breath she had taken in years. When Damien first explained the trap to her the following morning, laying out how the unlocked door would draw the Silver Court's agents directly into a ring of waiting guards, Elena listened carefully, and then immediately began arguing for a role in the plan itself, rather than accepting the safety of her chambers, while others faced the danger meant for her. Absolutely not, Damien said, his voice sharper than she had yet heard it directed at her. You will remain in your chambers, guarded, while the trap closes around whoever comes through that door. If they want to make an example of me in front of the delegates, then let them try, with guards ready and waiting for exactly that, Elena argued, refusing to back down beneath the weight of his disapproval. Hiding me away only delays the danger, Damien. It doesn't end it. They'll simply try again another way, another night, when we're less prepared for it. I cannot lose you, Damien said, low and rough, the words slipping free before he seemed to fully intend them. Elena's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice, the fear beneath the anger finally fully visible. You won't, she said softly. I promise you, you won't lose me. But I refuse to sit safely behind a locked door, while you and Priya, and every guard in this castle, face danger meant for me. That's not who I am, Damien. It never has been." He studied her for a long moment, searching her face for any hint of uncertainty, and finding none, finally exhaled a long, resigned breath. "Then we do this together. But Elena, promise me you will trust the guards completely. Promise me you will not try to be a hero if things go wrong during the ceremony." "I promise to try," she said, which was the most honest promise she could truthfully offer, and something in Damien's small, resigned smile told her he understood that about her already, understood that a woman who had survived on her own, wits her entire life, would never simply stand back and watch danger unfold around her, without acting to help. Priya, listening from the doorway, allowed herself a small, knowing smile of her own. "She reminds me of you, Damien, when you were young and just beginning to understand what it meant to lead rather than simply follow." "That is either a compliment or a warning," Damien said dryly. "I cannot decide which." "Perhaps both," Priya said, before excusing herself once more, to continue the endless work of preparation, still stretching ahead of them. The following days passed in careful, methodical preparation. Guards drilled repeatedly on their positions, escape routes mapped and remapped, every possible variation of the coming confrontation discussed and planned for as thoroughly as time allowed. Elena spent hours with Priya, learning the layout of the Great Hall in detail, memorizing exit points and hiding places, determined that whatever happened during the closing ceremony, she would not be caught helpless or unprepared. She also spent time, in the quiet hours between preparations, simply sitting with Damien, the two of them stealing small moments of normalcy amid the mounting tension surrounding them. They shared meals in comfortable silence. They walked the gardens at dusk, watching the sky shift through shades of orange and violet before surrendering to darkness. They talked, sometimes about the danger ahead, but more often about smaller things, favorite foods, childhood memories, the strange, small details of two very different lives that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, begun to weave themselves together into something neither of them had anticipated finding. "I keep waiting to feel afraid of how quickly this has happened," Elena admitted one evening, as they sat together on a stone bench overlooking the darkened garden. "But mostly, I just feel certain, which frightens me more than the danger does, if I'm honest." "Certainty can be its own kind of fear," Damien said, understanding immediately what she meant without needing further explanation. "I have spent 5 years guarding against exactly this feeling, convinced it would only ever weaken me as a ruler. I find now that I was wrong about nearly everything I believed on that subject." "What changed your mind?" "You did," he said simply. "Watching you these past days, I have never once seen you weakened by anything. Not fear, not danger, not the weight of a bond neither of us asked for. If anything, I have watched you grow stronger with each new challenge placed in front of you. I no longer believe love and strength stand opposed to one another. I believe now they might simply be two names for the very same thing." Elena felt her chest tighten with an emotion too large to easily name, and rather than speaking, she simply reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together in the cool evening air, both of them content, for a little while longer, to simply sit together beneath the stars, gathering whatever strength and comfort they could, before the danger still waiting 5 days ahead finally arrived. 2 nights before the closing ceremony, Priya returned from a quiet visit to the merchant house under suspicion, her expression tighter than Elena had yet seen it. She found Damien and Elena together in the private study, maps and reports spread across the table between them, and closed the door firmly behind her before speaking. "The merchant house was empty," she said, "cleared out entirely, as though whoever ran it knew we were closing in. But I found this, left behind in a hurry, tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the back office." She placed a small, folded piece of parchment on the table, and Damien unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents while Elena leaned in close enough to read over his shoulder. It was a list, brief and coded, but Priya had already worked out enough of it to understand its meaning. "Names," Priya said grimly, "or rather, positions within the palace. A guard captain, a member of the kitchen staff, someone with regular access to the delegate quarters. I believe this is a list of the Silver Court's contacts, still working within these very walls." Elena felt a chill move through her, at the realization that danger did not simply wait outside the palace gates, but had already embedded itself somewhere among the people she passed every single day, without a second thought. "We cannot move against all of them at once without alerting whoever remains free," Damien said, thinking quickly through the implications. "If we arrest even one before the ceremony, the others will scatter, and the Silver Court will simply try again through some new channel we haven't yet discovered. Then we watch them," Elena said, quietly, "and we let the ceremony proceed as planned, using their own movements against them when the moment finally comes." Damien studied her for a moment, something like fierce pride flickering behind his eyes. "You continue to think like someone who has spent far longer than a week navigating dangerous politics, Elena Voss. I spent my whole childhood learning to read people who might hurt me if I wasn't careful enough," Elena said quietly. "I suppose that kind of caution simply carries forward into new circumstances, whatever shape the danger happens to take." Priya nodded slowly, already turning her mind toward the practical matter of watching the identified contacts without alerting them to the fact that they had been discovered. "I will have trusted guards assigned to observe each of them discreetly. If any of them move toward the side door during the ceremony, or attempt to signal outside contacts, we will know immediately." The plan settled into place over the following hours, every detail refined and rehearsed until Damien, Priya, and Elena all felt as prepared as circumstances would allow, for whatever the closing ceremony might bring. But preparation, Elena understood, could only carry them so far. Some dangers could not be fully planned for, no matter how carefully the pieces were arranged beforehand, and as the final night before the ceremony finally arrived, she found herself lying awake once more, staring at the ceiling above her bed, wondering which of tomorrow's careful plans would hold, and which might unravel entirely, once real danger finally arrived at their door. Unable to sleep despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs, Elena finally gave up entirely and made her way to the familiar garden balcony, needing the cool night air to steady the racing thoughts crowding her mind. She found Damien already there, as she had somehow known she might, standing at the railing, with the same tension visible in his shoulders that she carried in her own chest. "You couldn't sleep either," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I find I cannot rest easily, knowing what tomorrow may bring," he admitted. Elena turned to look at him, at the exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and felt an ache settle deep in her chest, at the sight of a king who carried the weight of an entire kingdom, and yet still found room to fear for her safety above nearly everything else. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, "I need you to know that I don't regret any of this. Not the letter, not the knife, not even the Silver Court trying to end my life before it's truly begun. I would rather have had this week with you than a lifetime of the safe, quiet nothing I had before I ever set foot in this castle." Damien's hand found hers on the railing, his fingers warm and steady against her own. "You will have more than a week, Elena. I intend to make certain of that, whatever it costs me. Is that a promise, Your Majesty?" "It's a vow," he said, and the weight in his voice told her he meant every word of it. A king who had never knelt for anyone standing beside her now as an equal, ready to fight for a future neither of them could have imagined, only days before this one. They stood together a while longer, watching the lights of the sleeping city below, each drawing quiet strength from the other's presence, in a way neither of them fully needed words to explain. Eventually, Elena broke the comfortable silence with a question that had been circling her thoughts for days. "Damien, if tomorrow goes wrong, if something happens to me during the ceremony, despite every precaution we've taken, what will you do?" His grip on her hand tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge she had not heard from him before. Something fierce and slightly dangerous beneath the careful control he usually maintained. "I would tear this kingdom apart, searching for whoever caused it. I would not rest, not for a single day, until every last thread connecting back to the Silver Court had been unraveled and answered for." "That's not a comforting answer." "I know," he said, softening slightly, "but it's an honest one. I have spent 5 years learning to control my temper, to think before acting, to rule with patience rather than fury. I do not know if that control would survive losing you, Elena. I would rather not discover the answer to that question tomorrow, if we can help it." "We can help it," Elena said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. "We've planned carefully. Priya has watched every contact on that list. The guards know exactly where to position themselves. Whatever the silver cord intends, we're ready for it. I hope you're right. I usually am, Elena said, attempting lightness to ease the heavy weight still hanging between them. That earned her a small, genuine laugh, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly at the sound of her own steady confidence. I have noticed that about you. Yes. Along with a stubborn refusal to accept help even when it's freely offered. I accept help, Elena protested. I simply prefer to earn my own way through difficulty, rather than relying entirely on someone else to carry me through it. There is a difference between relying entirely on someone and allowing them to stand beside you while you carry your own weight, Damien said gently. I would like to think that is what we've built together these past days, rather than simple dependence in either direction. Elena considered his words carefully, recognizing the truth in them despite years of instinct, telling her to guard against exactly this kind of partnership. I think you might be right about that. I usually am, he said, echoing her own words back to her, with a small, teasing smile that chased away, for just a moment longer, the shadows still gathered at the edges of the coming morning. They remained together on the balcony until the sky began to lighten toward dawn, neither of them willing to surrender the fragile peace of the night for the uncertain danger waiting just beyond it. When Damien finally walked her back to her chambers, he paused at her door, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair back from her face, with a gentleness that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. Rest, if you can, he said softly. Even an hour will help steady you for what's ahead. Will you rest too? I will try, he said, though they both understood it was likely another promise neither of them would fully manage to keep, before the sun rose fully over the coming day. He left her at her door with a soft, lingering press of his lips against her forehead, a promise rather than a claim, gentle enough to steady the racing of her heart rather than quicken it further. Elena stood alone afterward, fingers pressed lightly to the place his lips had touched, watching the last of the castle's torches flicker and dim across the courtyard below, as the world outside slowly shifted from darkness toward the pale gray light of morning. Whatever waited for them within the great hall that day, Elena understood, standing there in the quiet dawn, that she would face it not as the frightened girl who had once hidden in a root cellar praying simply to survive, but as a woman who had chosen, freely and completely, to stand beside someone worth fighting for, danger and uncertainty be entirely damned. Morning arrived with a strange clarity, the fear and uncertainty of the previous night giving way to a calm, focused readiness Elena had not expected to find within herself. Grace arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying a deep green gown Priya had chosen specifically for the ceremony, its color meant to help Elena stand out clearly among the crowd should the guards need to locate her quickly during any confusion. You look tired, miss, Grace said gently, helping Elena into the gown with careful hands. Did you manage any sleep at all? A little, Elena admitted. Enough to get through today, I hope. Grace paused in her work, studying Elena's face with a kindness that had grown between them over the past days of quiet conversation, whenever their paths happened to cross. Whatever happens today, miss, know that half this castle has come to care for you already, in the short time you've been here. You're not facing this danger alone, whatever fear might tell you in the quiet hours. Elena felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes, touched by the simple kindness of a woman who owed her nothing beyond the ordinary courtesy required of her position. Thank you, Grace. That means more than you probably realize. I mean every word of it, Grace said, resuming her careful work with the gown's laces. I've watched you these past days, miss, and you're not what the rumors made you out to be. You're not some outsider scheming her way into the king's favor. You're simply someone who ended up somewhere unexpected and chose to meet it with more courage than most people manage in a lifetime. The words settled warm and steady in Elena's chest, exactly the kind of quiet strength she needed, heading into a day that promised danger at every turn. Once the gown was properly laced and her hair carefully arranged, Elena studied herself in the small mirror provided within her chambers, hardly recognizing the composed, determined woman looking back at her. She thought of Hollow Creek, of the 12-year-old girl who had hidden in a root cellar while raiders tore through everything she had ever known, praying simply to survive one more day. That girl could never have imagined standing here, dressed in fine cloth, preparing to face down an ancient conspiracy, alongside a king who had chosen to kneel for her rather than claim her. And yet here she stood, transformed not by circumstance alone, but by every difficult choice she had made along the way, each one building toward the woman now studying her own reflection, with steady, unflinching eyes. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she opened the door to find Priya waiting, dressed for the ceremony herself, her expression carrying the same focused calm Elena recognized in her own reflection moments before. Priya asked. "As ready as I think I can be," Elena said honestly. Priya studied her for a moment, something warm flickering behind her, usually sharp, measured gaze. "You have grown a great deal, in a very short time, Elena Voss. I have watched many people pass through this castle over the years, seeking favor, seeking power, seeking any number of things for themselves. I have rarely seen anyone grow the way you have, simply by facing whatever came next with honesty and courage, rather than calculation. I don't feel particularly brave," Elena admitted. "Mostly I just feel determined not to let fear make my choices for me anymore." "That is precisely what courage actually looks like, in my experience," Priya said. "The absence of fear is not bravery. It is simply carelessness, or ignorance of the danger at hand. True courage is choosing to act despite the fear, exactly as you have done these past days." They walked together toward the great hall, Priya reviewing the final details of their plan one last time as they moved through the familiar corridors, guards nodding to them with quiet respect as they passed. Elena listened carefully, memorizing each detail, though her mind kept circling back, despite her best efforts, to the image of Damien standing beside her on the balcony the night before, his hand warm around hers, his voice steady, with a vow she intended to help him keep, whatever the coming hours might demand of either of them. They reached the entrance to the great hall just as the first delegates began arriving, nobles and dignitaries filing in beneath banners and lanterns prepared for the summit's formal closing. Elena took a steadying breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward into the gathering crowd, ready, at last, to face whatever waited for her within. Damien found her near the edge of the gathering crowd before the ceremony formally began, drawing her briefly aside into a quiet alcove, away from curious eyes. He looked every bit the composed and untouchable king the kingdom knew him to be, though Elena, who had learned to read the small signs of his tension over the past days, could see the careful stillness in his hands, the way his eyes tracked the hall with far more attention than any formal ceremony typically required. "You look ready," he said softly, his gaze moving over her with quiet warmth despite the tension of the moment. "I feel ready," Elena said, as strange as that is to admit, given everything we're walking into. "Remember what we discussed," Damien said. "Stay near the front, where the guards can reach you quickly. Trust their movements, even if your instincts tell you otherwise in the moment. And Elena, whatever happens, know that I will not let anything happen to you if it is within my power to prevent it." "I know," Elena said, reaching up to briefly touch his arm, steady and reassuring beneath her fingers. "We've prepared as well as we possibly could. Now we simply have to trust the plan, and each other." Damien's expression softened, some of the tension easing from his shoulders at her steady confidence. "I do trust you, Elena, more than I have trusted anyone outside Priya in a very long time." "Then let's go finish what the Silver Court started," Elena said, forcing more confidence into her voice than she entirely felt, though the words seemed to steady them both regardless. They separated then, Damien moving toward the front of the hall to take his place upon the throne, Elena finding her position near the front of the gathered crowd exactly as planned, close enough to the guards for safety, visible enough in her deep green gown, that anyone searching for her would have little difficulty locating her within the crowd. The hall filled slowly around her, delegates and nobles arriving in careful procession, the familiar sounds of music and quiet conversation filling the space exactly as they had during the summit's opening ceremony weeks before. Elena scanned the crowd carefully, searching for any sign of the contacts Priya had identified from the merchant house's hidden list, though nothing appeared visibly out of place among the gathered nobility. She caught sight of Lord Caleb near the back of the hall, his silver rings catching the light exactly as they had that very first night, his expression carefully neutral despite whatever calculations Elena suspected were turning behind his composed exterior. He met her eyes briefly across the crowded hall, and something in his expression, some flicker she could not quite name, sent a fresh chill of warning through her chest. Whatever role he played in the danger still gathering around them, Elena understood, watching him carefully from across the hall. Today would finally reveal the truth of it, one way or another, before the ceremony reached its inevitable conclusion. The music shifted, signaling the ceremony's formal beginning, and Elena straightened her shoulders, steadying her breathing, preparing herself as fully as she could for whatever the coming hours would demand of her courage, and of the careful plan they had all worked so hard to build together. The first hour passed without incident. Delegates rose to give their closing remarks. Trade agreements were formally sealed with careful signatures, and wax seals pressed by trembling, ceremonial hands. Elena translated where needed, her voice steady despite the tension coiled tight in her chest. And slowly, dangerously, the hall began to relax into the comfortable rhythm of a ceremony nearing its natural end. It was during the final toast, as goblets were raised across the hall in honor of the summit's successful conclusion, that the side door finally opened. Elena felt it before she saw it, a sudden shift in the air, a wrongness that prickled along her skin, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. She turned toward the door just as three cloaked figures slipped through it, moving with the practiced silence of people who had planned this exact moment carefully, for weeks, perhaps longer. Now, Damien's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, and the hall erupted into motion. Guards poured from every hidden corner, closing around the cloaked figures before they had taken more than a few steps into the hall. Delegates screamed and scattered, goblets shattering against the stone floor, chaos rippling outward in every direction at once. Elena, remembering her promise to trust the guards, forced herself to stay rooted near the front of the hall rather than running toward the danger, though every instinct screamed at her to help however she could. The three figures fought back with a speed and skill that spoke of serious training, cutting through the first wave of guards with brutal, practiced efficiency. Elena watched, heart in her throat, as one of them broke free of the closing circle and turned, with terrible purpose, directly toward her. She did not scream. She had promised herself, that very first night with the knife against her throat, that she would not waste breath on screaming when she could use it for thinking instead. She turned quickly, searching for anything she might use to defend herself, her hand closing around a heavy silver candle stand from a nearby table, its weight solid and reassuring against her palm. The figure closed the distance faster than she expected, but before the blade could reach her, Damien was there, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, placing himself directly between Elena and the danger, without a single moment's hesitation. What followed happened too fast for Elena to fully track, a blur of movement and steel, Damien's careful control giving way to something fiercer and more primal beneath it. The fight ended quickly, the attacker disarmed and pinned to the ground within moments, Damien's chest heaving with the effort of restraining the fury that had risen in him at the sight of a blade turned toward Elena. The other two attackers were subdued just as quickly by the surrounding guards, the hall gradually settling from chaos into a tense, watchful stillness. Delegates pressed against the walls, guards standing firm around the captured figures, and Damien kneeling over the man who had come closest to hurting Elena, his hand fisted in the attacker's collar, his voice low and dangerous, in a way she had not yet heard from him. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The man said nothing, his eyes darting nervously toward the crowd of watching delegates, and Elena, watching from where she stood frozen near the overturned table, saw the moment his gaze landed briefly, deliberately, on Lord Caleb standing near the back of the hall. It was only a flicker, gone as quickly as it appeared, but Elena had spent her whole life reading the small, careful movements of people who wanted something, and she recognized fear when she saw it clearly. The attacker was afraid, not of Damien, but of whoever waited beyond this hall to punish failure severely. "He won't talk while he's this afraid," Elena said, moving forward, despite the guard's attempts to keep her back from the scene. "Not here, in front of everyone watching." Damien looked up at her, something in his expression easing at the sight of her standing whole and unharmed, even as the fury from moments before still simmered visibly beneath his careful control. "Take them to the lower cells," he ordered the guards. "We will question them properly, away from prying eyes and listening ears." As the guards moved to obey, Damien rose and crossed the small distance to Elena, his hands finding her shoulders, checking her over with the same careful urgency he had shown after the first attack in the corridor weeks before. "You're not hurt," he said, though his voice shook slightly with the effort of believing it fully. "I'm fine," Elena said, And this time, the words came out steadier than they had the first time she had spoken them, days ago, in a different corridor, before either of them had fully understood what was truly growing between them. Around them, the hall slowly began to settle, delegates murmuring nervously among themselves, guards clearing the shattered goblets and overturned tables, the ceremony that had begun with music and toasts ending instead in the aftermath of an attempted attack that every noble in the kingdom would be speaking of for weeks, if not months, to come. Lord Caleb, Elena noticed, had slipped quietly from the hall sometime during the chaos, his absence noted by more than a few watchful eyes, though no proof existed yet to tie him directly to the failed attack that had just unfolded. "He's gone," Elena murmured to Damien. "I noticed," Damien said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "He will not escape this so easily. Whatever role he played in tonight's events, I will find the proof to prove it, even if it takes every resource this kingdom has to offer." That night, in the quiet aftermath of the failed attack, Damien personally oversaw the questioning of the 3 captured attackers, Priya at his side, Elena watching from a corner of the room, unwilling to be sent away despite the darkness of the task still ahead of them. The questioning was thorough but not cruel, Damien's control never once slipping into the kind of violence Elena had half feared she might witness. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. The attackers confirmed what Priya had already suspected, that they had been hired through intermediaries connected to the Silver Court, though none of them could offer direct proof linking Lord Caleb himself to the plot, beyond simple suspicion. "He's too careful to leave evidence," Priya said afterward, once the attackers had been secured, and the room had emptied of all but the 3 of them. "Every thread leads close to him, but never close enough to prove anything in a formal court of law." "Then we will need to be cleverer than careful," Damien said, exhaustion finally beginning to show through the composed mask he had worn throughout the entire evening. Elena, watching him rub a tired hand across his face, felt something shift in her chest, a tenderness she had not expected to feel for a king who had, only weeks ago, been nothing more to her than a stranger, with storm-colored eyes, and a voice that commanded silence with a single word. "You should rest," she said softly. "You've been awake far too long already. I cannot rest while danger still circles you." "You won't be any use to me exhausted," Elena pointed out gently. "Rest tonight. We'll face Lord Caleb with clear heads tomorrow morning." Damien studied her for a long moment, something soft and unguarded slipping through the exhaustion in his eyes. "When did you become the one taking care of me, instead of the other way around?" "Probably around the time you started sending guards to check on me every single hour," Elena said, a small smile tugging at her lips, despite the weight of the evening still pressing down around them. "Turns out caring runs in both directions, whether either of us fully intended it to." Priya, watching the quiet exchange with the same knowing look she had worn days before, excused herself with a soft good night, leaving the 2 of them alone in the aftermath of a night that had nearly ended in tragedy, and had instead only deepened whatever bond had begun growing between them since that very first corridor. Damien walked Elena back to her quarters himself, refusing any argument about needing rest of his own first, and at her door, he paused, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair back from her face, with a gentleness that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "I almost lost you tonight," he said quietly. "You didn't." "I know, but I felt it. In the moment that man turned toward you, I felt exactly how much losing you would cost me, more clearly than I have ever felt anything in my entire life." His hand lingered against her cheek, warm and careful. "I have ruled this kingdom for 5 years, without ever once feeling afraid of losing anything. You have undone that entirely, in the span of a single week." Elena leaned, almost without meaning to, into the warmth of his touch. "Maybe that's not such a terrible thing, Damien. Maybe being afraid to lose something means you've finally found something worth keeping close." His eyes searched hers for a long moment, something fierce and tender warring behind the storm-gray depths, and then, slowly, giving her every chance to step back if she wished it, he leaned down and pressed a soft, careful kiss to her forehead, a promise more than a claim, gentle enough to steady the racing of her heart rather than quicken it further. "Rest well, Elena," he murmured against her skin. "Tomorrow, we finish what Lord Caleb started, once and for all." Long after he had gone, Elena stood by her window, fingers pressed lightly to the place his lips had touched, watching the last of the castle's torches flicker out, one by one, across the darkened courtyard. Somewhere beyond those walls, Lord Caleb was surely awake as well, already scheming his next move, in a game that had nearly cost Elena her life. And yet, standing there in the quiet dark, Elena found she was no longer afraid, the way she had been in that very first corridor. She had spent her whole life believing she needed no one, that her own strength alone would always be enough to carry her through whatever danger came her way. She still believed in that strength completely. But for the first time, standing at that window, with her heart still racing from the night's events, she understood that needing no one and choosing to stand beside someone were not the same thing at all, and that choosing Damien, freely and fully, took nothing away from the woman she had always fought so hard to become. It only made her stronger, in ways she was only beginning to fully understand. Morning brought with it a strange kind of clarity, the sort that only comes after a night spent staring at ceilings, turning over truths too large to fully accept in the dark hours before dawn. Elena woke before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, dressed quickly, and made her way toward the small dining room where she had taken most of her meals since arriving at the castle, expecting to find it empty at such an early hour. Instead, she found Damien already there, seated at the long table with a map spread before him, though his eyes were fixed not on the parchment, but on some distant point she could not see from where she stood. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, and the tired lines around his eyes softened slightly at the sight of her walking through the doorway. "You didn't rest," she said, taking the seat across from him. "I rested some," he admitted. "Enough to think clearly, at least, about what comes next for both of us. About Lord Caleb? About many things." He set down the quill he had been holding, folding his hands together atop the table with careful deliberation. "Elena, there is something I should have told you more fully before now, about the bond between us, and what accepting it fully would actually mean for your life going forward." Elena felt her chest tighten with a familiar wariness, though she pushed it down, reminding herself that Damien had given her no reason yet to doubt his honesty in anything he had told her so far. "Tell me now, then," she said. "I'd rather understand everything clearly than continue guessing at what this means for either of us." Damien took a slow breath, as if steadying himself for a difficult admission he had been avoiding. "Among my people, the mate bond is considered sacred, but it is not without real cost. Once accepted fully, by both parties, it cannot be undone. It ties two lives together, in ways that go beyond simple affection, beyond even love, as most people commonly understand it. It changes how we sense each other, how we feel each other's pain sometimes, occasionally even each other's thoughts, in moments of particularly strong emotion. That sounds like a great deal to accept, on top of everything else already happening." "It is," Damien agreed. "And there is more still. Tradition holds that when a king finds his true mate, he claims her formally before his court, binding her to his throne, his protection, and his responsibilities, as surely as his own crown binds him to this kingdom. It is not a small thing, Elena. It would mean a life very different from the one you knew back in Hollow Creek, in ways both wonderful and genuinely difficult." Elena studied him carefully, searching for the fear she expected to feel at such weighty words, and finding, instead, only a quiet steadiness she had not fully anticipated within herself. "Why are you telling me this now, after everything else that's already happened between us? Because you deserve to understand fully what you are choosing, before you choose it completely," Damien said. "I will not claim this bond, Elena, not formally, not before the court, not in any way that takes the choice away from you entirely. I have watched too many people in positions like mine use power to take what they want, without ever truly asking first. I refuse to be one of them, not with you, not ever." Something warm and fierce swelled in Elena's chest at his words, a feeling too large to easily name in the moment. She had expected, on some level, that a king raised in traditions of claiming and ruling might see the bond as something owed to him, something he could simply take once its existence became fully known between them. Instead, he sat across from her, offering her the very choice tradition told him he did not strictly need to offer, because he understood, in a way few in his position ever truly did, that a bond built on anything less than true free choice was no bond worth having at all in the first place. "You could have claimed it already," she said quietly. "During the summit even, Before any of this danger began, you could have told the whole hall the truth and forced my hand before I fully understood what I was even agreeing to. I could have, Damien admitted. The old part of me, the part shaped entirely by tradition and expectation, wanted to, if I'm being fully honest with you. But the rest of me, the part that has come to truly know you these past days, could never have done that to you. I would rather lose the bond entirely than win it through anything less than your free and willing choice, made with full understanding of everything it means. Elena reached across the table, covering his hand with her own, feeling the slight tremor beneath his skin, the effort it clearly cost him to say these words aloud, to lay himself so open before her without any guarantee of how she might respond. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly, "and for trusting me enough to let me choose, instead of simply deciding for both of us. Does this change anything?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, though she could hear the vulnerability trembling beneath it clearly. Elena considered the question seriously, weighing the weight of everything he had told her against the quiet certainty that had been steadily growing in her chest since that very first night in the corridor, when a knife's cold edge had somehow led her toward exactly this moment instead. "It changes how much I understand about what I'm choosing," she said finally. "It doesn't change the choice itself, Damien, not even a little." The relief that broke across Damien's face was almost painful to witness. So raw and unguarded, it stole the breath from her lungs entirely. He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together, with a gentleness that belied the strength she knew he carried within him at all times. "Then know this," he said quietly. "Whatever you choose, whenever you choose it fully, I will wait as long as it takes for you to be ready. I have ruled this kingdom for 5 years, believing love was a weakness kings could not reasonably afford to carry. You have taught me, in the span of a single remarkable week, that love freely given and freely chosen is the greatest strength a king could ever hope to claim for himself." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching in the corridor outside, Priya appearing in the doorway with an expression that immediately pulled both of their attention away from softer things and back toward the danger still surrounding them. "We found something," Priya said, breathless. "A ledger, hidden in Lord Caleb's private study, detailing payments to the same merchant house that funded the attackers from last night. It's not conclusive proof of his direct involvement on its own, but combined with everything else we've gathered, it's enough to bring him before the court for formal questioning." Damien rose immediately, the softness of the moment before giving way to the sharp focus of a king, facing down a serious threat to his kingdom's stability. "Where is he now?" "That's the trouble," Priya said grimly. "No one has seen Lord Caleb since last night's attack. His chambers are entirely empty. It appears he fled sometime shortly after the failed attempt in the hall, likely realizing his role would soon come to light." A cold weight settled in Elena's stomach at the news. A guilty man fleeing was, in some ways, more dangerous than a guilty man caught, especially one with resources and connections stretching into an ancient and powerful court that clearly extended well beyond the palace walls. "Then we find him," Damien said, his voice hard with determination. "Before he has the chance to regroup and attempt something even more dangerous than what we've already faced." The search for Lord Caleb consumed the following days entirely, guards fanning out through the city and surrounding countryside, Priya coordinating a careful search of every property and connection tied to his name across multiple records. Elena, unwilling to sit idle while the danger to Damien's kingdom, and to herself, remained unresolved, threw herself into the search as well, her sharp eyes catching details others might have overlooked in the ledgers and correspondence recovered from Caleb's abandoned study. It was Elena, in fact, who first noticed the pattern hidden within the ledger's careful columns of numbers, a series of payments that did not simply lead to the merchant house funding the attackers, but continued further still, tracing a path toward a property just beyond the city's northern border, one registered under a name that meant nothing to the guards searching the records, but that struck Elena with sudden, cold recognition the moment she read it. "This name," she said, showing the ledger to Damien with hands that had gone slightly unsteady. "I know this name. It belonged to a man who used to trade goods through Hollow Creek, years ago, before my parents died. He always seemed too well connected for a simple traveling merchant, even back then, though I never questioned it as a child." Damien's eyes sharpened with sudden understanding. "You think this connects back to your village somehow?" "I think," Elena said slowly, the pieces beginning to align in her mind with terrible clarity. That the Silver Court's interest in me might not have started the night I arrived at this castle. I think it might have started long before that, and I never knew it until this very moment. The implication hung heavy in the room, a truth too large to fully process all at once. If the Silver Court had known of Elena's importance long before the summit, long before the mate bond had even fully formed between herself and Damien, then the raid that had taken her parents' lives, the raid the village guards had arrived too late to prevent, might not have been the random tragedy Elena had believed it to be for the whole of her life since. It might have been the very beginning of a plan that had followed her, unseen and unknown, for the entirety of her existence. "We need to find that property," Damien said, his voice tight, with barely restrained fury at the implications now unfolding before them both. "If Lord Caleb is hiding there, or if there is any information connecting the Silver Court's interest in you back to Hollow Creek directly, we need to find it, before he has the chance to destroy the evidence entirely, or worse still." Elena nodded, her jaw set with a determination that matched his own completely. Whatever answers waited at that property, whatever truth had been hidden from her for the whole of her life without her knowledge, she intended to face it fully, not as a frightened village girl caught up in forces beyond her understanding, but as a woman who had already survived a knife, a threatening letter, and a violent ambush, and who refused to let fear dictate the choices still ahead of her now. "Then let's go find them," she said. "Together, exactly as we've faced everything else so far." Damien's hand found hers once more, steady and certain, and together they began the careful preparations for the journey north, gathering a small, trusted escort, rather than a large and visible force that might warn Lord Caleb of their approach, long before they arrived at his hiding place. The ride north took the better part of a full day, the countryside rolling past in shades of green and gold that reminded Elena, painfully, of the hills surrounding Hollow Creek, though she pushed the memory aside carefully, focusing instead on the difficult task still waiting ahead of them. She rode beside Damien for most of the journey, his hand finding hers whenever the terrain allowed their horses to walk close together, a silent reassurance neither of them needed words to properly understand between them. "Tell me about your parents," Damien said quietly, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward evening. "If you're willing to share more with me." Elena was quiet for a long moment, memories she had kept carefully boxed away for years, slowly surfacing under his gentle question. "My mother made the best bread in Hollow Creek. Everyone said so, though I think half of them just liked an excuse to visit her at the ovens each morning. My father worked with wood, chairs and tables and small toys for the village children. He used to carve little animals for me when I was young. I still have a few of them, packed away in a chest I haven't properly opened in years. They sound like good people," Damien said softly. "They were," Elena said, her voice steady despite the weight of the memory pressing against her chest. "I was 12 when the raid happened. I remember hiding in the root cellar with our neighbor's children, while the sounds outside went on longer than I thought anything possibly could last. When it finally went quiet, and we came out, half the village was gone entirely. My parents were among those who didn't survive the night." Damien's hand tightened gently around hers, offering silent comfort without needing to speak. "I'm sorry, Elena. No child should ever have to survive something like that alone." "I used to believe it was simply bad luck," Elena continued, her voice remaining steady despite everything. "Raiders, looking for an easy target, choosing a village too small, and too far from any real protection to fight back properly against them. I never imagined there might have been a deeper reason hiding behind it all along." They reached the property just as the sun began sinking below the western hills, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet that would have been beautiful under any other circumstance. The house itself was smaller than Elena had expected, a modest stone building set back from the main road, surrounded by overgrown gardens that suggested it had not been properly tended in quite some time. Damien signaled the guards to spread out and secure the perimeter, before approaching the front door himself, Elena close behind him, despite his earlier insistence that she remain safely back with Priya, until the property had been cleared entirely of any danger. "I told you I don't sit idle while others face danger." "Meant partly for me," Elena reminded him, when he opened his mouth to protest her presence at his side. Damien's expression softened into something between exasperation and reluctant admiration for her stubbornness. I remember that about you clearly. I simply hoped you might make an exception, just this once, given the circumstances. Not likely, Elena said, a small, determined smile touching her lips despite the tension of the moment. The front door opened easily beneath Damien's hand, unlocked and slightly ajar, as though someone had left in a hurry without bothering to secure it properly behind them. Inside, the house showed clear signs of recent occupation, a fire recently extinguished in the hearth, dishes left unwashed on a small table nearby, though no sign of Lord Caleb himself remained anywhere within the modest structure. It was in a small back room, tucked behind a locked door that one of the guards forced open with a heavy shoulder, that they found what they had truly come searching for. Shelves lined the walls, filled with carefully organized documents, ledgers, and correspondence, spanning what appeared to be years, perhaps even decades, of careful and deliberate record-keeping. Elena moved slowly through the room, her eyes scanning the labeled boxes and folders, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and desperate hope that she might finally find answers to questions she had carried, unknowingly, for most of her life, without ever understanding why. It was Priya who found the folder marked with the name of Hollow Creek, tucked near the back of one of the highest shelves, as though someone had wanted it kept deliberately out of casual reach from anyone searching quickly. "Elena," Priya said quietly, and something in her tone made Elena's stomach drop, before she had even crossed the room to see what Priya had actually found within it. The folder contained years of careful observation, notes tracking a small village in the northern hills, tracking specifically, Elena realized with growing horror, a single family within that entire village. Her family. There were notes about her mother's lineage, tracing back generations to a bloodline the documents referred to only as the old line, a bloodline the Silver Court had apparently been monitoring for reasons the documents did not fully explain in detail, though the implications were clear enough regardless. The raid on Hollow Creek had not been random at all. It had been deliberate, timed and planned carefully, meant to eliminate a threat the Silver Court had identified years before Elena herself had ever understood what she truly carried within her own blood. "They killed my parents because of me," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words feeling foreign and impossible, even as she finally spoke them aloud for the first time. "Because of some bloodline I never even knew I carried until this very moment." Damien's arms came around her, before she fully realized she was swaying on her feet, steady and warm, holding her together, as the weight of the revelation threatened to break something deep inside her chest entirely. "This is not your fault, Elena," he said fiercely. "None of this is your fault. You were a child. You knew nothing of any of this at the time it happened." "But they knew," Elena said, anger beginning to burn through the shock, sharp and clarifying in equal measure. "They knew, and they let an entire village burn to try and end something they were too afraid to face directly themselves. And they will answer for it," Damien said, his voice hard with a fury that matched her own completely. "I promise you that, Elena. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, the Silver Court will answer fully for what they did to your family, and for everything they have tried to do to you since." As the guards began carefully packing the recovered documents for the journey back to the castle, Elena stepped outside into the cool evening air, needing a moment away from the weight of everything the small stone house had revealed to her in a single afternoon. Whatever grief and anger still churned inside her, she understood, standing alone beneath the darkening sky, that this truth, however painful, finally gave shape to a tragedy she had spent years believing had no deeper meaning at all. Damien followed her outside a few moments later, giving her the space she needed before settling quietly beside her, close enough to offer comfort without crowding the grief and anger still working through her chest. "I spent years believing my parents' deaths were simply bad luck," Elena said softly, staring out at the darkening hills stretching before them. "A tragedy with no deeper meaning, just the cruel randomness of the world working against us. Somehow, knowing there was a reason, a purpose behind it, makes it feel worse, not better, than I expected it might." "I understand," Damien said quietly. "Meaningless tragedy is its own kind of horror. But tragedy with purpose, tragedy chosen deliberately by people who valued their own power over innocent lives, carries a different weight entirely, one that demands a different kind of answer." "What do we do now?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful weight he gave every decision affecting his kingdom's future. Now, we take this evidence back to the castle. We use it to finally corner Lord Caleb, and through him, whatever connections remain to the Silver Court within my own court. And we make certain, Elena, that whatever they intended for you and your bloodline, it ends here, with us, rather than continuing to threaten whatever future you choose to build for yourself going forward. Elena turned to look at him, at the fierce determination burning behind his storm-gray eyes, and felt something steady and certain settle in her own chest, despite the grief still raw within her. Together, she said, echoing the word he had offered her days before, when everything between them had still felt new and uncertain. Always, Damien said, and this time, when his hand found hers, she did not hesitate at all, before lacing their fingers together, drawing strength from the connection between them, as they turned back toward the house, and the long road ahead that would carry them, together, back toward whatever confrontation still waited at the castle for both of them. The journey back to the castle passed in a blur of careful planning, Damien and Priya working through the evening hours by lantern light, mapping out exactly how to use the evidence recovered from the northern property to expose Lord Caleb and whatever remained of his connections within the court. Elena, though still carrying the weight of the revelations about her parents, found a strange kind of comfort in the work itself, in having a clear purpose to focus on, rather than sitting alone with grief that threatened to overwhelm her if given too much quiet space to grow unchecked. They arrived back at the castle 2 days later, travel-worn but resolute, only to find the court already buzzing with rumors that had somehow spread rapidly during their absence. Lord Caleb, it seemed, had not simply fled into hiding as they had assumed he would. He had instead traveled to a gathering of allied nobles just beyond the capital, and there, in a move none of them had anticipated, he had told his own version of events, one that painted himself as a loyal lord raising legitimate concerns about a king bewitched by an outsider of unknown and possibly dangerous bloodline. "He's turning this against us," Priya said grimly, reading through the reports that had reached the castle during their absence, with visible frustration. "He's telling anyone who will listen that Elena is a threat to the kingdom's stability, that the mate bond itself is proof of dangerous influence, rather than a sacred connection worth protecting." "That's absurd," Elena said, though a cold thread of worry wound through her chest at the thought of an entire court turning against her, based on carefully constructed lies. "Absurd or not, some of the nobles are listening to him," Damien said, his jaw tight, with barely controlled anger at the audacity of the claims being spread. "Fear travels faster than truth, especially when it's dressed up in careful, reasonable-sounding words, designed to sound plausible. Then we need to move quickly," Elena said, "before his lies have the chance to take deeper root among the nobles who might otherwise support us." Damien called a formal court gathering for the following morning, one that would include not only his own advisors and guards, but the very nobles Lord Caleb had been courting with his poisoned version of events. It was a risk, laying out the evidence so publicly for all to see, but Damien argued, and Elena agreed completely, that half measures and quiet, private confrontations would only allow Lord Caleb further room to twist the truth in the shadows where he operated most comfortably. The only way to end his influence for good was to bring everything into the light, all at once, before the entire assembled court could witness it directly. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion from the long journey, Elena found herself once again on the familiar garden balcony, watching the same city lights that had first stolen her breath, what felt like a lifetime ago, though barely 2 weeks had actually passed since that very first evening. She did not hear Damien approach until he was standing beside her, his presence as familiar now as her own heartbeat had become over these past strange, extraordinary weeks. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he asked quietly. "No," Elena admitted honestly. "But I don't think being ready is really an option anymore. I think we just have to face it, and trust that the truth is strong enough to outweigh his carefully constructed lies." "It will be," Damien said, with the kind of certainty she had come to rely on deeply. "The evidence is clear, Elena. What happened to your parents, what the Silver Court has been planning for years, none of that can be argued away with clever words, not when the proof sits directly in front of the entire court." Morning arrived far too quickly, the weight of the coming confrontation settling heavy over the castle, as nobles and advisors gathered in the great hall, murmurs of speculation rippling through the crowd, as they took their places for what promised to be a decisive reckoning. Elena stood near the front of the hall, dressed simply but with her chin held high, refusing to let the weight of so many watching eyes shrink her the way they might have, once, before she had learned exactly how much strength she truly carried within herself. Lord Caleb arrived last, flanked by a handful of nobles he had clearly convinced, at least partially, of his version of events. His confidence, Elena noted carefully, seemed slightly less polished than it had been at the summit weeks before, a thin crack showing beneath the careful composure he wore, like armor against scrutiny. Damien took his place upon the throne, and the hall fell silent beneath the weight of his presence, every eye turning toward him expectantly. "I have called this gathering," Damien began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall without need for raising it, "to address the rumors and accusations that have spread in recent days regarding Miss Elena Voss, and regarding my own conduct as king of this realm. I intend to lay out the full truth before this court today, and let the evidence speak entirely for itself." He gestured, and Priya stepped forward, presenting the recovered documents to the gathered nobles, walking them carefully through the evidence they had found, the ledger connecting payments to the attackers, the letter bearing the Silver Court's official seal, the years of careful surveillance targeting Elena's family, long before she had ever set foot within the capital's walls. The hall grew increasingly restless as Priya laid out each piece of evidence methodically, murmurs of shock and outrage rippling through the crowd, as the true scope of the conspiracy became painfully clear to everyone assembled. Lord Caleb, Elena noticed, had gone pale, his earlier confidence crumbling visibly beneath the weight of proof he clearly had not expected them to recover so thoroughly, or so quickly. "This is outrageous," Lord Caleb finally said, his voice sharp with forced indignation that did not fully mask the fear beneath it. "You expect this court to believe documents conveniently discovered in some abandoned property, with no proof of my direct involvement in any of this? The property was registered under a name, connected to payments made from your own personal accounts," Priya said calmly, producing a final document that made Lord Caleb's face go entirely white with recognition. "We traced the financial records carefully, my lord. The connection is quite clear to anyone examining it honestly." The hall erupted into noise, nobles turning to whisper urgently among themselves, several of those who had previously stood alongside Lord Caleb, now visibly stepping back from him, putting careful distance between themselves and a man whose guilt seemed increasingly undeniable to everyone watching. Damien rose from his throne, and the hall fell silent once more beneath his commanding presence. "Lord Caleb," he said, his voice cold and final, carrying the full weight of his authority, "you have conspired with an ancient court against the safety of a guest within my own halls. You have hidden the truth of a conspiracy that led to the deaths of an entire village, including the parents of the very woman you sought to have killed within these walls. You have lied to this court, and to nobles you called allies, in an attempt to protect your own guilt from discovery." Lord Caleb's composure finally shattered entirely, his careful mask giving way to something desperate and afraid beneath it. "I did what was necessary to protect this kingdom's stability, Damien. The Silver Court has resources, connections, power that reaches farther than you understand, or are willing to admit. I was trying to protect us from forces you cannot even begin to comprehend fully." "You were trying to protect your own position," Damien said flatly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Do not dress your betrayal up as service to this kingdom before this court. I have seen exactly what your protection costs, Lord Caleb. I have seen the graves it leaves scattered behind it." The guards moved forward at Damien's signal, taking Lord Caleb into custody, amid a hall gone entirely silent with the weight of what had just unfolded before them. As he was led away, Lord Caleb's eyes found Elena's across the crowded hall, and for just a moment, something almost like genuine regret flickered across his face, before the guards pulled him from the room entirely, his protests fading into the corridor beyond. In the aftermath, as the hall slowly began to empty, nobles departing in hushed, urgent conversations about the implications of everything they had just witnessed, Damien crossed the room to where Elena stood, his hand finding hers in front of the entire remaining court without hesitation. "It's done," he said quietly. "Lord Caleb's role in this is finished, at least here within these walls. But the Silver Court itself remains," Elena said, the weight of that truth settling heavy between them both. "This was only one piece. of something much larger still waiting beyond these walls. Yes, Damien agreed. But today, we have proven that their reach, however far it extends, is not beyond challenge or exposure. And we have done it together, in front of witnesses who will carry that truth back to every corner of this kingdom and beyond. Not every noble who had once stood beside Lord Caleb fled the hall in silence. A handful remained behind, waiting nervously for their turn to speak once the crowd had thinned enough to allow it. Among them was a younger lord named Owen, barely older than Elena herself, who approached Damien and Elena with visible hesitation once the guards had fully cleared the hall of Lord Caleb's presence. "Your Majesty," Owen said, bowing stiffly, "I owe you, and Miss Voss, an apology. I believed Lord Caleb's account of events. I should have questioned it more carefully before lending him my support in this matter." "Fear makes fools of even careful men, Lord Owen," Damien said, his tone measured rather than harsh. "What matters now is what you choose going forward, not what you believed, before the truth was fully known to you." Owen's shoulders eased slightly at the response, gratitude flickering across his young face. "Then know that my house stands fully behind you, and behind Miss Voss, going forward from this day. Whatever the Silver Court intends next, they will find fewer allies within this court than they perhaps believe they still command." Elena watched the exchange with quiet interest, understanding that trust, once broken by fear and manipulation, could be rebuilt through honest accountability rather than punishment alone. She thought of Lord Caleb's cold smile that first night at the summit, and wondered how many other nobles had simply been frightened into supporting him, rather than genuinely believing the poison he had spread about her. Priya approached once the hall had mostly emptied, her expression carrying a weariness that spoke of the long hours she had poured into uncovering the truth over these past difficult weeks. "The immediate danger from Lord Caleb has passed, but I would caution against believing this fully resolves the threat surrounding us. The names recovered from that merchant house, the contacts still potentially embedded within this court, remain unaccounted for. Lord Caleb was never acting entirely alone in this." "I know," Damien said grimly. "We will continue the investigation. But today, at least, we have taken away his ability to poison this court against Elena from within its own walls." "Today is enough," Elena said softly, exhaustion from the long weeks finally catching up with her all at once. "Tomorrow, we can worry about whatever remains. Today, I would simply like to breathe for a moment without fear pressing against my chest." Damien's expression softened at her words, understanding the weight she had carried through every difficult revelation of the past days. "Then let us breathe together, for however long today allows us that small mercy." That evening, word reached the castle that the small delegation from Hollow Creek Elena had quietly sent for weeks before had finally arrived, drawn by news of the danger surrounding her and wishing to see for themselves that she remained safe and well cared for. Among them was Nora, an elderly woman who had known Elena's mother since childhood, her weathered face breaking into tears the moment she caught sight of Elena, standing whole and healthy near the castle gates. "Child," Nora said, pulling Elena into a fierce embrace despite her advanced years. "We heard such terrible rumors. Attacks, conspiracies, a whole kingdom in an uproar over you. I feared the worst, traveling all this way." "I'm all right, Nora," Elena said, tears pricking at her own eyes, at the familiar warmth of someone who had known her since before the world had grown so complicated and dangerous around her. "Truly, whatever danger remains, I am not facing it alone anymore." Nora pulled back slightly, studying Elena's face with the sharp, knowing eyes of a woman who had raised children and buried friends and understood grief and resilience in equal measure. "I only wish she could see it herself." "I wish that too," Elena said softly, the familiar ache of loss mixing now with something warmer, a sense of connection to the family she had lost, carried forward through the kindness of people who had never forgotten her, even after all these years apart. Damien, watching the reunion from a respectful distance, felt something settle warmly in his own chest at the sight of Elena surrounded by people who loved her simply for who she was, rather than for any title or bloodline the Silver Court found so threatening. Whatever battles still waited ahead of them, he understood, watching her laugh softly through her tears at some memory Nora had shared, that Elena Voss had never truly been alone in this world, whatever the danger around her might suggest otherwise. She had simply been waiting, all this time, for people willing to stand beside her, rather than merely watch from a careful, comfortable distance. Later that night, once the Hollow Creek delegation had settled into guest quarters prepared for them, and the castle had finally begun to quiet after the long, eventful day, Elena found Damien in his private study, still reviewing reports despite the lateness of the hour. "You should rest," she said gently, echoing words she had spoken to him more than once over these past weeks. "I know," Damien said, setting down the papers with visible reluctance. "I find it difficult to rest, knowing how much still remains unresolved beyond these walls." Elena crossed the room and settled into the chair across from him, studying his tired features with quiet concern. "Lord Caleb is imprisoned. The evidence against him is undeniable. Owen and several other nobles have pledged their support. Today was a victory, Damien, even if it wasn't a complete one." "I know that too," he admitted. "I suppose I simply struggle to feel the full weight of victory, while so much danger still lingers beyond our reach. The Silver Court elders remain untouched by anything we've uncovered so far. Whoever else within this court still serves their interests remains hidden from us entirely." "Then we continue searching," Elena said, carefully, patiently, "the same way we found the evidence against Caleb. We don't have to solve everything in a single day." Damien studied her for a long moment, something soft crossing his tired features despite the weight of the conversation. "You have a remarkable way of making impossible burdens feel more manageable, Elena. I'm not entirely certain how you manage it." "Practice," Elena said, a small smile touching her lips. "I've had a great deal of experience carrying burdens that felt impossible at the time. Eventually, you learn that most things become manageable, one small step at a time, even when the whole picture still feels overwhelming." He reached across the desk, taking her hand in his thumb tracing slow, absent circles across her knuckles. "I find myself thinking, more and more each day, about what comes next for us, beyond simply surviving each new threat as it arrives. I would like, eventually, to build something more permanent between us, Elena, when the time feels right to both of us." Elena's heart skipped slightly at the quiet vulnerability in his words, understanding exactly what he was carefully, gently suggesting, without pressing her for any immediate answer. "I think about that too, Damien. More than I expected to, given how quickly all of this has happened between us. Then perhaps, once this immediate danger has settled further, we might speak more fully about it," Damien said softly. "There is no rush, Elena. I only wanted you to know that my thoughts have already begun turning that direction, whenever you feel ready to consider it seriously yourself." Elena squeezed his hand gently, warmth spreading through her chest at the quiet promise held within his words. "I look forward to that conversation, Damien. Truly." They sat together a while longer in comfortable silence, the weight of the day's events slowly settling into something more peaceful between them, both of them drawing quiet strength from the other's steady presence, as the candles burned low around them, and the castle finally, gradually, settled into the deep, well-earned rest of a long and difficult day, finally reaching its close. In the weeks that followed Lord Caleb's arrest, the castle settled into an uneasy but hopeful rhythm. Investigations continued into the full extent of the Silver Court's influence within the kingdom, Priya working tirelessly alongside a growing team of trusted advisors to trace every remaining thread of the conspiracy, still hidden among the court's many familiar faces. Elena, no longer simply a visiting translator, found herself increasingly drawn into the daily workings of the court, her sharp mind and outsider's perspective proving valuable in ways even Damien had not fully anticipated when their story first began. She had not yet returned to Hollow Creek permanently, though word had been sent ahead assuring her few remaining acquaintances there that she was safe and well cared for within the capital. Part of her longed to see the familiar hills again, to visit her parents' graves with the new understanding she now carried of the tragedy that had taken them from her so young. But a larger part of her recognized that her place, for now, remained here, at the center of a conflict far from finished, beside a king who had become, in the span of a few short weeks, the truest home she had ever known in her entire life. It was during a quiet evening meal, nearly a month after the confrontation with Lord Caleb, that Damien raised a subject Elena had sensed building beneath his careful composure for days now. "There is a tradition," he said slowly, setting down his cup with careful precision, "among my people, for formally acknowledging a mate bond before the full court. It is not required, Elena. I have told you before, and I meant it fully, that I will never force this choice upon you. But I find myself wanting to ask, regardless, whether you might be ready to consider it now." Elena studied him for a long moment, watching the careful vulnerability beneath his measured words. "What does this tradition involve exactly?" "Typically," Damien said, "it involves the alpha kneeling before his mate, publicly, offering his crown and his protection as a gift rather than a claim, asking rather than demanding, her full acceptance of the bond already formed between them." "You would kneel, before the whole court, watching?" "Before anyone who cared to witness it," Damien said, without a moment's hesitation. "I have knelt for no one in 5 years of ruling, Elena. Not for nobles, not for foreign dignitaries, not for anyone who believed my position owed them such a gesture of respect. But I would kneel for you, gladly, because what exists between us was never truly about position or power. It was always simply about you, and the choice, I want you to know, remains entirely your own to make." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved by the weight of what he was offering. A king willing to publicly set aside every expectation of his own power, for the sake of making absolutely clear that whatever bound them together, it was chosen freely, by both of them, rather than claimed through tradition, or fate alone deciding it for them. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm ready, Damien. I think I've been ready for longer than I've allowed myself to admit." The formal acknowledgement ceremony was set for the following week, word spreading quickly through the castle and beyond, drawing not only the kingdom's own nobles but curious representatives from allied territories, eager to witness a moment that had not occurred within living memory. A king choosing to kneel rather than simply claim what tradition told him already belonged to him. Elena spent the days leading up to the ceremony in a strange mixture of anticipation and nervousness, Priya helping her prepare with the same careful attention she had shown throughout the weeks since Lord Caleb's exposure. The gown chosen for the occasion was deep green, the same shade Elena had worn the night of the failed attack during the summit's closing ceremony, a deliberate choice meant to honor the strength she had shown that night, rather than simply following tradition for its own sake. The morning of the ceremony arrived clear and bright, the great hall filled beyond capacity, with nobles and dignitaries and, much to Elena's surprise and deep gratitude, the same small delegation that had traveled all the way from Hollow Creek weeks before, familiar faces from her childhood standing among the grandeur of the royal court, come once more to witness this strange and wonderful turn her life had taken since leaving their small village behind. Elena walked the length of the hall alone, refusing any formal escort, choosing instead to enter on her own 2 feet, exactly as she had entered every important moment of her life before this one. She found Damien waiting at the front of the hall, dressed simply despite the occasion, his eyes finding hers the moment she stepped through the doors and holding steady on her face for the entire length of her walk toward him. When she reached him, the hall fell into a hush so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat clearly in the silence surrounding them both. Damien, without hesitation, without a single glance toward the watching court to gauge their reaction, sank slowly to one knee before her, in front of everyone gathered to witness it. "Elena Voss," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, though it remained soft enough to feel as though he spoke only to her alone. "I offer you my crown, not as a chain to bind you, but as a gift freely given. I offer you my protection, not because tradition demands it of me, but because I choose, every single day, to place your safety above my own without exception. I offer you this bond, fully formed between us, and I ask, not tell, but ask, if you will choose to accept it, and accept me, as your equal, in every way that matters between two people." Elena felt the weight of every eye in the hall upon her, felt the strange, surreal wonder of standing at the center of a moment she could never have imagined for herself, standing in a village that no longer existed in the way she remembered it, 12 years old, and hiding in a root cellar, praying simply to survive one more day of an uncertain future. She had survived. She had built a life from nothing, protected herself when no one else could, and found, against every expectation she had ever held for herself, a love that asked nothing of her, except her own free and honest choice, made without pressure or expectation weighing it down. "I accept," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears now falling freely down her cheeks, in front of the entire watching court. "Not because you knelt, and not because tradition says I should accept it, but because in every moment since that very first corridor, you have shown me exactly the kind of king, and the kind of man, worth choosing freely, over and over again, without hesitation. The hall erupted into sound, cheers and applause rising from nobles and villagers alike, and Damien rose from his knee, pulling Elena into his arms, as the sound washed over them, both of them laughing and crying in equal measure, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment they had just shared before the whole of the watching kingdom. Amid the celebration that followed, weaving through crowds of well-wishers and curious dignitaries eager to offer their congratulations, Elena found a quiet moment to speak once more with Nora, who had watched the entire ceremony, with tears streaming freely down her weathered face. "Your mother would be so proud," Nora told her, taking Elena's hands in her own aged ones with gentle affection. "She always said you were meant for something more than that little village could offer, though I doubt even she imagined this particular future for her daughter." "I miss them every day," Elena admitted softly. "I wish they could have seen this moment for themselves." "They see it," Nora said gently, squeezing her hands with quiet certainty. "Somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, I believe they see exactly the woman their daughter has become, and they are proud beyond any words I could offer you." The celebration continued long into the evening, musicians filling the hall with joyful melodies, while servants carried trays of food and drink among the gathered crowd, laughter and conversation blending together into a warmth Elena had never quite experienced before in her life. She danced, clumsily at first, and then with growing confidence, first with Damien, and then with several of the delegates who had traveled to witness the historic occasion, each partner offering their own quiet congratulations on the bond she had chosen so publicly and so bravely. As the hour grew late and the crowds began gradually to thin, Damien found Elena once more on the familiar garden balcony, the same place where so much of their story had unfolded over the past weeks since that very first fateful evening. "How does it feel?" he asked softly, coming to stand beside her, "to be formally bound to a king who knelt before the whole of his court, in front of everyone he rules?" "It feels," Elena said, leaning into the warmth of his side, "like exactly the beginning I never knew I needed, after everything I had already survived before it." Below them, the city lights burned bright and steady, the same lights that had first stolen her breath what felt like a lifetime ago, though only weeks had truly passed since that first night. So much had changed since then, and yet the view remained exactly the same, patient and constant, watching over whatever came next for the king who had knelt, and the woman who had never needed an alpha, but had chosen one anyway, freely and completely, entirely on her own terms. "I have something else to tell you," Damien said quietly, his tone shifting slightly, drawing Elena's attention away from the view and back toward him with sudden concern. "What is it?" "Word arrived this afternoon, just before the ceremony began. The Silver Court has responded to today's news, though not in the way I had hoped they might." Elena's chest tightened at the shift in his voice. "What have they done?" "They have begun rallying allied territories along the northern border," Damien said grimly. "It appears our public defiance of their traditions has not gone unnoticed, nor unanswered. I did not wish to spoil today's celebration with this news any sooner than necessary, but I did not want to keep it from you either." Elena absorbed the news carefully, the warmth of the evening tempering into something more solemn, though not entirely fearful. She had faced knives and letters and ambushes already. Whatever the Silver Court intended next, she understood. Standing there in her wedding finery beside the man she had chosen freely, she would face it exactly as she had faced everything else since that very first corridor. "Then we prepare," she said simply. "Together. Exactly as we always have." Damien's hand found hers, steady and certain, despite the weight of the news he had just delivered. "Together," he agreed. "Whatever comes next, Elena, we face it as equals, exactly as we promised each other tonight." Neither of them yet knew, standing together beneath a sky full of stars, wrapped in the quiet joy of a bond chosen freely by both of them, exactly how severely that coming test would push everything they had built together. But for tonight, at least, that danger remained, for just a little while longer, safely beyond the horizon, allowing them this one perfect, uncomplicated evening, before the storm finally arrived at their door. The attack came 3 weeks after the ceremony, not with the quiet subtlety of a hidden blade or a poisoned letter, but with the open, undisguised force of an army massing at the northern border. Word reached the castle at dawn, a rider arriving half dead from exhaustion, his horse foaming at the mouth from the desperate pace of the journey, carrying news that the Silver Court had finally abandoned subtlety entirely, rallying allied territories sympathetic to their cause into an open show of force against Damien's kingdom. "They mean to make an example of us," Damien said grimly, studying the reports Priya had gathered through the morning. His war council assembled in the same study where Elena had first shown him the threatening letter weeks before. Having failed to remove Elena quietly, they now intend to remove the threat entirely, by force, and send a message to any other king who might consider defying their traditions in favor of a freely chosen bond. Elena stood at the edge of the council table, having refused, despite gentle suggestions from more than one advisor, to be sent somewhere safer, while the kingdom's leaders planned their response. "How large is the force gathering against us?" "Larger than we can comfortably match without calling in favors from our own allied territories," Priya admitted, her expression grave. "The Silver Court has spent generations building influence across many kingdoms. This will not be a small skirmish we're facing." Damien's jaw tightened, the weight of the coming conflict settling visibly across his shoulders. "Then we call in every favor we have. Send riders to the eastern territories, to the coastal alliance, to every ruler who owes this kingdom a debt of honor. If the Silver Court wishes to make this a war, we will meet them with everything this kingdom can muster in response." The following days passed in a blur of preparation, the castle transforming from a place of quiet celebration into a fortress bracing for conflict. Guards drilled in the courtyards from dawn until dusk, their movements sharp and focused. Riders departed daily, carrying urgent requests for aid to every corner of the known territories. Elena, refusing to sit idle while the kingdom she now called home prepared for war, threw herself into whatever tasks proved useful, organizing supplies, coordinating with the healers preparing for potential casualties, and even, much to the surprise of several skeptical guards, proving herself surprisingly capable with a blade during the training sessions Damien insisted she attend, given the danger that now surrounded her more directly than ever before. "You've fought before," Damien observed one evening, watching her spar with one of his most trusted guards, her movements sharp and efficient, despite lacking the formal training most soldiers received throughout their lives. "I told you," Elena said, slightly breathless from the exertion. "I've spent my whole life learning to protect myself. A girl who survived what I survived learns quickly how to defend herself, one way or another, whatever the circumstances demand of her." Word came, 10 days into their preparations, that the Eastern Territories had agreed to send reinforcements, followed shortly after by similar news from the Coastal Alliance. Debts of honor called in, and answered by rulers who valued Damien's past support enough to risk their own forces in his defense now. The reinforcements would not arrive in time to prevent the Silver Court's forces from reaching the capital's outer walls, but they would arrive close enough behind to turn what might have been a devastating siege into a battle Damien's forces stood a genuine chance of winning against overwhelming odds. The Silver Court's army reached the capital's outer defenses on a gray, overcast morning that felt fitting for the violence about to unfold across the surrounding countryside. Elena stood atop the castle's highest tower alongside Damien and Priya, watching the distant lines of soldiers spread across the horizon like a dark stain against the green countryside, a sight that stole the breath from her lungs with its sheer, overwhelming scale. "There are so many," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Damien agreed, his voice steady, despite the tension visible in every line of his body. "But we are not facing them alone, Elena. And we are fighting for something worth defending, whatever the cost proves to be." The battle, when it came, unfolded across long, grueling hours that Elena would remember for the rest of her life as a blur of noise and chaos, and desperate, focused determination to survive and to protect what mattered most. She had been given a position within the castle's medical stations, tending to the wounded as they were carried back from the fighting, her steady hands and calm presence proving invaluable amid the panic and pain surrounding her on every side. Damien fought at the front lines himself, refusing every suggestion that a king should remain safely removed from direct combat, leading his forces with the same fierce, controlled power Elena had witnessed that very first night in the corridor, when a single word from him had been enough to make a knife-wielding attacker drop his blade in immediate fear. The tide of battle shifted precisely when the eastern and coastal reinforcements finally arrived, crashing into the Silver Court's forces from an unexpected flank and throwing their carefully organized lines into sudden, complete chaos. Elena, working tirelessly among the wounded, felt the shift in the battle's momentum through the changing reports carried back to the medical stations, the growing hope replacing the earlier grim determination in the voices of those bringing news from the front lines. It was well into the evening, the sky darkening toward night, when word finally reached the castle that the Silver Court's remaining forces had begun a full retreat, their commanders recognizing the battle as lost against the combined strength of Damien's kingdom and its loyal allies. Elena, exhausted from hours of tireless work among the wounded, felt relief wash through her so powerfully, her knees nearly buckled beneath its overwhelming weight. She found Damien near the castle's main gate, as the last of the fighting wound down, his armor dented and bloodied, though the blood, she quickly confirmed with desperate hands checking him over carefully, belonged mostly to others rather than himself. He pulled her into his arms the moment he saw her, holding her with a fierce, trembling relief that spoke of exactly how much fear he had carried through the long hours of battle. Fear not for himself, but for the possibility that this day might end with her safety compromised, despite every precaution they had taken together. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "For now, at least. It's finally over." "For now?" Elena asked, pulling back slightly to study his face carefully. Damien's expression turned grave despite the relief still visible beneath it. "The Silver Court's army has retreated, but the court itself remains, its elders and its influence still intact, beyond the reach of this single battle we've won today. We have won today, Elena, but I do not believe this conflict is fully finished between us and them." Elena considered his words carefully, exhaustion warring with the sharp clarity that had carried her through the long hours of tending the wounded throughout the day. "Then we prepare for whatever comes next, the same way we prepared for this battle, together, exactly as we always have." In the days immediately following the battle, as healers worked tirelessly to tend the wounded, and the castle slowly began accounting for its losses, Elena found herself walking the makeshift medical wards each morning, offering what comfort she could to soldiers recovering from injuries sustained defending a kingdom, and a woman many of them had never met before that single, terrible day. Among the wounded was a young guard named Daniel, barely older than the servant boy who had unlocked the side door weeks before, his arm bound tightly in bandages from a blade wound sustained protecting a retreating group of civilians during the worst of the fighting. "You didn't have to fight for me," Elena told him gently, sitting beside his cot as he winced through a change of dressing performed by a tired healer. "Wasn't just for you, miss," Daniel said, managing a weak smile despite his obvious pain. "Was for the kingdom too, but I'll admit, knowing what the Silver Court did to your family made it easier to understand exactly what we were fighting against, made the whole thing feel more real, somehow, than just following orders blindly." Elena felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, understanding that her own story, painful as it remained, had given the soldiers something concrete to fight for, beyond abstract loyalty to a crown they had never personally chosen. She sat with Daniel a while longer, listening to him talk about his own family, a sister back in a small farming village not unlike Hollow Creek, and found herself grateful, despite everything, for the strange connections forged even in the aftermath of violence and loss. Priya, meanwhile, worked alongside Damien to assess the full cost of the battle, counting losses among their own forces, and gathering intelligence from captured Silver Court soldiers about the scope of the Elders' remaining resources and intentions going forward. "They will not simply accept this defeat quietly," Priya warned, during a tense council meeting held 3 days after the battle's conclusion. "The Silver Court has weathered setbacks before, throughout its long history. They will regroup, reconsider their approach, and likely attempt something more subtle next time, now that open warfare has proven too costly for their purposes. Then we cannot simply celebrate this victory and move on, as though the danger has passed entirely," Damien said, his expression thoughtful despite the exhaustion still visible beneath it. "We need a more permanent solution than simply winning individual battles as they come. "What do you propose?" Elena asked. Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful weight he gave every decision affecting his kingdom's future. Negotiation. Not surrender, and not endless warfare either, but a formal treaty, one that forces the Silver Court to recognize the legitimacy of freely chosen bonds, removing their claimed authority to interfere through force or manipulation ever again. Would they even agree to such terms, after everything that's happened between us? Elena asked skeptically. Perhaps not willingly, Damien admitted. But today's battle proved something important, Elena. It proved that direct conflict costs them more than they anticipated, more than they are likely willing to continue spending indefinitely against a kingdom with allies willing to answer the call for aid. Negotiation from a position of demonstrated strength often succeeds where negotiation from weakness never could. Word arrived from the retreating Silver Court forces just over a week later. Not another attack as many had feared, but a formal request for negotiation, the court's elders apparently recognizing, at least for the moment, that further direct conflict would cost them more than they were currently willing to spend, pursuing their original goals against Elena and her bloodline. Damien, with Elena and Priya both closely involved in every discussion, spent weeks negotiating the terms of a fragile peace, one that would not fully resolve the deeper tensions the Silver Court's traditions represented, but that would, for now at least, halt the immediate threat of further violence against Elena and against the kingdom that had chosen to stand beside her through every difficult trial they had faced together. The negotiations proved difficult, the Silver Court's representatives cold and calculating in ways that tested Damien's patience repeatedly throughout the long weeks of discussion that followed. Their chief representative, an elderly woman named Helen who carried herself with the same practiced composure Elena had once observed in Lord Caleb, argued every point with careful, deliberate precision, conceding nothing without extracting some compromise in return. "Your Majesty asks a great deal," Helen said, during one particularly tense session held in the Great Hall, weeks after the battle's conclusion. "Generations of tradition, set aside for the sake of a single bond, formed between yourself and an outsider of unproven loyalty to established order. Elena Voss has proven her loyalty and her strength far more thoroughly than most who have held titles within this court for generations," Damien replied evenly, refusing to let the insult provoke him into rash words he might later regret. "The tradition you defend nearly cost an entire village their lives, and did cost Elena her parents, simply for the crime of carrying a bloodline your court found inconvenient to its own interests." Helen's composure flickered, just slightly, at the direct accusation laid bare before the assembled witnesses. "The old line has always represented instability to the careful balance our court has maintained across many generations of careful work." "Perhaps," Elena said, speaking for herself, directly for the first time during the formal negotiations, drawing every eye in the hall toward her. "Or perhaps the instability you fear is simply the natural result of people choosing their own paths, rather than accepting the paths your court has decided for them, without ever asking their consent. I did not choose this bond because tradition demanded it of me. I chose it freely, exactly as any person deserves the right to choose the course of their own life." The hall fell silent at her words, and Helen studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her carefully guarded eyes. "You speak with more conviction than most who have challenged our court's authority before you, Miss Voss." "I've had a great deal of practice defending my own choices," Elena said simply. "I don't intend to stop now, whatever additional pressure your court chooses to apply going forward." Slowly, piece by piece, over the following weeks, a treaty began to take shape between the two sides, one that formally recognized the validity of freely chosen mate bonds, removing, at least officially, the Silver Court's claimed authority to interfere with such bonds through force or manipulation ever again in the future. It was not a perfect resolution. Elena understood, as did Damien, that treaties written on parchment could not fully erase generations of tradition and belief, that some among the Silver Court's ranks would likely continue to view their bond as a threat requiring eventual correction, whatever the formal agreement claimed on paper. But it was a beginning, a foundation, upon which a more lasting peace might eventually be built between two very different ways of understanding love, loyalty, and the right to choose one's own path forward. The treaty was formally signed on a bright autumn morning, The kingdom's nobles and allied representatives gathered once more in the great hall, though this time, the mood carried none of the tension that had marked the earlier confrontation with Lord Caleb months before. This gathering felt instead like a genuine celebration, relief, and hope mingling freely among the assembled crowd, as Damien and Helen formally sealed the agreement that would, they all hoped, mark the beginning of a lasting peace between their two very different worlds. Elena stood beside Damien throughout the ceremony, no longer simply a translator caught up in circumstances beyond her understanding, but a woman fully recognized now, by nobles and allies alike, as an equal partner beside the king, who had chosen to kneel for her, and who had fought, alongside her, for a future neither of them had dared imagine when they first met in that dark, dangerous corridor, so many months before this moment. Spring arrived slowly that year, the castle grounds gradually shedding the last traces of winter's chill, as new growth pushed through the gardens Elena had come to love during her time within these walls. It had been nearly a year since that first fateful night at the summit, a year that had carried her through danger and grief, and a love she had never expected to find. And now, standing once more on the familiar balcony overlooking the city she had come to call home, Elena found herself reflecting on exactly how far she had traveled since that terrified girl had hidden in a root cellar, praying simply to survive one more day of an uncertain future. The kingdom had healed, slowly, from the wounds of the Silver Court's brief war, the treaty holding steady through the months since its signing, though Damien remained watchful, understanding that lasting peace required constant tending, rather than blind faith placed in a single piece of parchment alone. Lord Caleb remained imprisoned, his trial having concluded months before with a sentence that reflected the full weight of his betrayal, though Elena had found, to her own surprise, that she carried less anger toward him now than she once had, understanding, in some strange way, that fear and ambition had driven his choices as much as true malice ever had. Hollow Creek, too, had begun to heal in its own quiet way. Elena had finally returned there, months after the treaty's signing, walking once more through the hills of her childhood, visiting her parents' graves with a peace she had not thought possible when she first learned the truth of their deaths. She had used a portion of her own resources that had grown considerably since her formal bonding to Damien, to help rebuild the village properly, ensuring that Hollow Creek would never again face a raid without adequate protection to defend itself against future threats. Today, though, Elena's thoughts were focused on a different milestone entirely, one that had been building slowly over the past months, growing naturally from the partnership she and Damien had built together through danger and difficulty alike. The kingdom's council had approached Damien weeks before, formally requesting that Elena be crowned queen, not simply as his bonded mate, but as a ruler in her own right, recognizing the contributions she had made not only to their survival during the Silver Court's threat, but to the ongoing governance of the kingdom itself in the months since that difficult season had passed. Elena had taken time to consider the offer carefully, understanding fully the weight such a title would carry, the responsibilities and expectations that came with formally ruling alongside Damien, rather than simply standing beside him as his chosen mate. She had spent long evenings discussing it with him, weighing every consideration with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to every important decision in her life. "You do not need the crown to matter to this kingdom," Damien had told her, more than once, during those long evening discussions. "You have already proven your value here 1,000 times over, with or without a formal title attached to your name." "I know that," Elena had replied. "This isn't about proving my value, Damien. It's about choosing, freely, to take on this responsibility, because I believe I can do good with it, not because anyone requires it of me to feel complete." And so, standing now on the balcony in the soft spring air, Elena waited for the sound of Damien's footsteps that would signal it was time to make her way to the great hall, where the formal coronation would take place before the assembled court and the many allied dignitaries who had traveled to witness this next chapter of a story that had already become something of a legend across the surrounding territories. "Are you ready?" Damien asked softly, appearing beside her with the same quiet steadiness that had first drawn her to him so many months before this moment. "I think I've been ready for this my whole life," Elena said, turning to face him with a smile that held none of the fear or uncertainty that had once defined so much of her existence. "I just didn't know it yet, until you helped me discover it within myself." They walked together toward the great hall, hand in hand, exactly as they had faced every challenge since that first dangerous night in the corridor. The hall, when they entered, was filled beyond capacity. Familiar faces mixed among the crowd. Priya standing near the front alongside a delegation from Hollow Creek that had traveled specifically for this occasion. Nora among them, her weathered face bright with unmistakable pride. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of formal words and solemn tradition. Elena, kneeling before Damien, as he placed the crown upon her head, with hands that trembled slightly with emotion, despite the steady control he had maintained through so many difficult moments over the past year together. When she rose again, now formally recognized as queen in her own right, the hall erupted into sound, cheers and applause washing over her with a warmth that settled deep into her chest, chasing away, finally and completely, the last traces of the frightened, orphaned girl, who had once believed she needed no one, that depending on anyone would only lead to disappointment and loss in the end. She had been right, in a way, that she needed no one. She had survived on her own strength for years, had built a life from nothing, through her own hard work and sharp mind alone. But she understood now, standing crowned before a hall full of people who had come to love and respect her for exactly who she was, that needing no one, and choosing to build something extraordinary, alongside someone worthy of that choice, were entirely different things altogether. Damien took her hand once the applause had settled, turning to address the assembled court with words that carried the weight of everything they had built together over the past remarkable year. "A year ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "I believed a king's heart was a weakness he could not afford. That ruling required a kind of distance from love and vulnerability alike. I was wrong about nearly all of it. This kingdom stands stronger today, not despite the love I share with my queen, but because of it, because she has taught me, every single day since that first night, that true strength comes not from ruling alone, but from choosing, freely and fully, to build something greater, alongside someone who challenges you to become better than you were before you knew them." He turned to Elena, his eyes soft with a love that had only deepened through every trial they had faced together over these past months. "Elena Voss once told me she did not need an alpha to complete her. She was right, she has never needed anyone to complete her. But I am endlessly grateful, every single day, that she chose me anyway, not out of need, but out of a love freely given, and freely returned in equal measure." The hall erupted once more into applause, and Elena, tears bright in her eyes despite the joy filling her chest, leaned into Damien's side, drawing strength and comfort from his presence, exactly as she had every day since that very first corridor, where a knife's cold edge had, against every possible expectation, led her toward the truest home and the truest love she had ever known in her entire life. In the years that followed, the kingdom flourished under their combined rule, Elena's sharp mind and compassionate heart proving as valuable to the kingdom's governance as Damien's strength and steady leadership had always been. Together, they worked to strengthen the treaty with the Silver Court into something more lasting than a single piece of parchment, slowly building trust between traditions that had once seemed impossibly opposed to one another. Hollow Creek grew into a thriving village once more, protected and prosperous under the careful attention of a queen who never forgot where she had come from, even as she embraced fully the future she had chosen for herself, with open eyes and an open heart. Owen, the young lord who had once apologized for supporting Lord Caleb's lies, grew into one of Damien and Elena's most trusted advisors, his early mistake transformed through years of loyal service into genuine friendship and mutual respect. Priya continued to serve as Damien's closest counsel, her sharp mind and steady wisdom guiding the kingdom through countless smaller challenges that arose in the years following the Silver Court's defeat. Grace, the servant who had first warned Elena about Lord Caleb's false smile, remained a familiar and welcome presence throughout the castle, eventually rising to oversee the household staff entirely, her quiet kindness never once forgotten by the queen she had comforted during that very first frightening night so many years before. Daniel, the young guard who had fought so bravely during the battle against the Silver Court's forces, recovered fully from his injuries and went on to lead his own company of guards, often telling new recruits the story of the night he had understood, for the first time, exactly what he was fighting to protect within his own kingdom's walls. Elena Voss, the village girl who had once believed she needed no one, who had built walls thick enough to keep out an entire world of potential hurt and disappointment, had become a queen not through the sacrifice of that hard-won independence, but through the discovery that true partnership required no such sacrifice at all from either side. She remained, always, the fiercely capable woman who had faced down a knife with sharp words rather than screams, who had refused to run from danger, even when running would have been so much easier, who had chosen, freely and completely, to stand beside a king who had knelt not to claim her, but to honor the strength and independence that had first drawn him to her, in that dark, fateful corridor so many years before. And Damien Ashford, the ruthless king who had never knelt for anyone in 5 long years of ruling, remained forever changed by the woman who had taught him that love, freely chosen and freely given, was not the weakness he had once believed it to be, but the greatest strength a king, or a queen, could ever hope to claim for themselves and for the kingdom they had chosen to build together. Their story, whispered eventually across every corner of the known territories, became something of a legend in its own right, a tale told to young girls who believed, as Elena once had, that strength meant standing entirely alone, and to young rulers who believed, as Damien once had, that power required a heart closed off from love entirely. It was a story that reminded all who heard it that true strength was never about needing no one, but about choosing, freely and completely, the ones worth standing beside, through danger and difficulty alike, until the very end of whatever journey lay ahead. On quiet evenings, long after the coronation and the treaty and every battle they had fought together, Elena and Damien could still be found on that same familiar balcony, watching the same city lights that had first stolen her breath, on a night neither of them had expected to change everything about their lives. The view remained exactly as it always had, patient and constant, a quiet witness to everything that had grown between a king who learned to kneel and a woman who never needed him, but chose him anyway, completely, and without regret, for as long as they both should live.